Let's see. I see Nate. Hi, Nate. Nate, in your honor, this is what I got for lunch. All right.
I'm jealous.
Yeah, well, you know, the Quincy Market Outpost, conveniently located vis-a-vis City Hall. All right, I see Daphne, Sylvia. Who else on your team, Nate, are we waiting on?
Ethan?
Yeah, Ethan Domelmont-Burns, the head of special education, will be joining us as well. I don't know if he's in the waiting room.
Not yet. I've got a Porsche Paulding in the waiting room. Is that somebody BPS or?
Yeah, she's on Ethan's team.
Okay, great.
Hey, Nate.
Counselor Flynn, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Great.
Hi, Mariam.
Hello. Long time no see.
It's good to be with everybody.
Okay, so we're just waiting on Ethan and Eva.
Ava Mitchell will not be joining us this afternoon, so we're just waiting on Ethan.
I do have a message into Ethan, so trying to track him down for you.
Here he is. He's just appeared. You can stop your tracking.
So once Megan says something, we have
I
options
was going to
too.
say, once Megan starts moving.
That's right.
We're learning.
Okay, all right, then, Chief, are we ready to go? Okay, great. So we got plenty of ground to cover. So calling this hearing of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee to order. For the record, my name is Kenzie Bach. I'm the District 8 Counselor and also the Ways and Means Chair. This hearing today is being recorded and live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-tv. It will also be broadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and FiOS Channel 964. It's part of the budget review process, which is about 35 working sessions and hearings. We've got a whole bunch of those with BPS, and of which this is one. And we do look for your participation as a member of the public. So you can send us an email with your testimony at ccc.wm. That's ccc.wm@boston.gov. You can also go on boston.gov/council-budget to see when all the hearings are. And if you go to boston.gov/budget-testify, you can find out how to come join us here in the Zoom room and testify at the end of the hearing. You can also upload a video on that website, which we can then play at the conclusion of the hearing. And we'll have 2 dedicated public testimony hearings that are just about you and your testimony, no presentation, and at 6 p.m. so they're more convenient for folks in the evening. Those are on May 25th. There's one focused on BPS, and on June 3rd, one that's a catch-all for anything about the budget that you want to talk about. So we do hope you'll get involved. You can also informally tweet us your questions, comments using the hashtag BOSSBudget, BOSBudget. Today's hearing is on docket 0524 to 02526, orders for the FY22 operating budget, including annual appropriations for departmental operations for the school department and for other post-employment benefits. Docket 0527 to 0528, orders for capital fund transfer appropriations. dockets 0529 to 0531, orders for the capital budget, including loan orders and lease purchase agreements. We're focused today on BPS Commitment 1 in their strategic plan, which is eliminate opportunity and achievement gaps. And we're in sort of the second part of that focus. So this morning we talked about wraparound services, social and emotional learning, mental health supports, a whole bunch of things. This afternoon, we're going to be focused especially on the specialized academic supports. So inclusion, special education transitions, ELL, our bilingual education plan, and also talk a bit about sort of tutoring, vacation, summer programming. We're joined by BPS's Chief Financial Officer, Nate Cooter, the Budget Director, Miriam Rubin, the Superintendent for Special Education, Ethan Doublemont-Burns, Daphne Germain, our Assistant Superintendent of the Office of English Learners, Sylvia Romero Johnson, our Chief of Academics, and Megan. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Counselor Ed Flynn of District 2, Counselor Asabi George at large, Counselor Flaherty at large, Counselor Liz Braden of District 9, and Counselor Michelle Wu at large. So without further ado, I will pass it back over to Nate to give our presentation, and then we'll jump into questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Chairperson Bach, and thank you, members of the council, and for those in the Boston community who are watching at home as well. As Chairwoman Bach mentioned, today's presentation is focused on specialized academic supports as a strategy for closing achievement and opportunity gaps. We'll be focusing specifically on English learner supports and supports for students in special education. I want to briefly put this in the context of our overall work. And of course, we begin every budget presentation with this statement from the Opportunity Achievement Gap policy, and no more appropriate than today, where we talk about some of our more vulnerable learners and those who need specialized supports. Our goal, quite simply, is to make sure they have the same opportunity to achieve greatness as anyone else enrolling in BPS. This year's budget is a $36 million increase over our FY21 budget. We are extremely fortunate to be able to benefit from continued investment from the City of Boston at times when other municipalities are having to use federal funding to backfill lost revenue. 100% of our new investments are going to supporting students, and this is part of a 3-year, $100 million rollout of new investments in BPS. So FY22 is the second year where we're receiving this. And again, I cannot express appreciation enough for our partners in the city. This is one slice of our overall investments. We are very fortunate to be able to have funds so that we can target supports and services to students. We know that the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on our English learners, on our students in special education, on our historically marginalized populations. Recovery will be difficult, but we have the resources that we need across general funds, federal funds, and aligning our capital funds budget to make sure we meet these students' needs. The next slide provides an overview of the federal funds that are coming in addition to the general funds. We have ESSER Part 1, or what has been referred to as CARES Act funding, which was part of this year's FY21 budget, as well as the city allocated an additional $23.2 million. Among other things, this helped fund the rollout of one-to-one computing. And we are beginning the planning process. This Thursday is the first of the ESSER Commission meetings. We'll have a public engagement around how we should use the ESSER funds to change the trajectory for students and help our district. The pandemic has also had an impact on the system overall, and this was a topic of the hearing this morning where we talked about enrollment declines and the need to support our students. It's important that as we think about how we use our funds, that we are positioning our district not only to meet the needs of students who are recovering from the pandemic, but to make sure we have a district that emerges from the pandemic stronger and that emerges ready to reimagine what is possible. And so with that, I want to introduce the framework, which we've been talking a lot about, which is our FY22 budget is geared around returning well, recovering strong, and reimagining what is possible for our students. We need to make sure that we are prepared to support students in in this recovery, and to not just come back as the district that we were, because for too many of our students, and this is particularly appropriate for our conversation around achievement and opportunity gaps, but for too many of our students, the district was not working for them before the pandemic. So we must come back as a different district to help meet their needs, not only to recover from what happened during this pandemic, but to make sure that they end up in a better place. I mentioned briefly the federal relief funding. We're using our strategic plan as the anchor point, and having a public dialogue about how we should use these funds. And so throughout the hearing, you may hear about some of the things that we're already thinking. And as you start to propose other ideas for us to explore, this will be part of the public engagement for when we submit the application for ESSER Part 2, which is due in July. As we transition into the first segment, I'm gonna, at this point, turn it over to our head of special education, Ethan Domblemont-Burns, who will present the next section.
Thank you, Nate, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about our budget with you, Chairperson Bach, and the entire council, and also thank you to everyone watching and being involved in our community. In terms of special education, we know we're in a really critical space for all our students. In many ways, the pandemic has hit our students with disabilities the hardest, and we want to make sure that we are able to put the things in place so that, as Mr. Kruder said, we are able to return, recover, and hopefully reimagine so that we can come back stronger than we were. So here, and I just want to say before getting into the slides, like a lot of that will happen through the ESSER funding as well, and continued spending of CARES Act money as well. So here are some highlights from our central office work. Is that for 21-22, we are increasing our ABA program, and this is really due to a need from enrollment. So we're increasing personnel, 16 new ABA specialist positions, 2 new ABA program directors, and more in ABA contracts as well. And that is really because of the demand. We will be hiring an executive director in the Office of Special Education to really focus on strategy, enhancing school supports, and thinking through strategically what needs to happen over the next number of years so that we can improve performance of our students with disabilities. We're grateful that all our central contracts have been level funded for Ed Plan, for Goal Book, and other teacher development tools. Really extremely important. We're excited this year that we have made an investment in a digital assessment library, which really helps our school psychologists and all our special education staff with conducting assessments efficiently, so that we can have better identification and ensure appropriate placement. We're also expanding our literacy interventions through Wilson and Orton Gillingham this year, so that we will be beginning that actually before we get out for the summer, so that we can ensure staff can attend. And then lastly, our transition contracts are level funded, and so that we can make sure that our students age 14 to 22 are able to be engaged in the way that they need so they can get to their adult services appropriately and with the best possible services. And we're going to go to the next slide. Really just is an overview of educational environment by race, ethnicity, and gender. And so you see both race and gender, each bar as a race and gender is broken up that way, and then by setting. And so overall, excuse me, not by setting. Overall, it is 44% students with disabilities, 44% Latinx, and 36% Black. Special education students are 12% white, and then 3% Asian. What's interesting to point out is that although DESE has not found Boston to demonstrate significant disproportionality with regards to identification of students with disabilities, We know that the patterns over time, that there is underrepresentation and overrepresentation of certain groups in certain programs. And this does, sorry for my confusion, it does have the setting here. Those are the different colors in each bar. And so an example of some of the disproportionality that we look at is that while nearly 62% of all students with disabilities are enrolled in an inclusion setting, rates vary by student group. 52% of Black male students are enrolled in an inclusion setting compared to 70% of white male students. Whereas 67% of female students are placed in fuller inclusion settings, the rate for male students is 59%. And lastly, a concern is that Black students overall have the highest rates of placement within substantially separate settings at 37%, compared to 29% for students with disabilities overall. And for Black male students, this rate increases to 39%. So as we develop our strategic plan, this is data that we'll be looking at really carefully so that we can address this disproportionality. Thankfully, there is some good news with regard to our students with disabilities and their graduation rates. For students with disabilities between 2015 and 2020, the graduation rate has increased 2%, modest, but heading in the right direction. Also, the percent of students with disabilities dropping out has actually decreased 3.6%. Which is terrific. And also the rates of students who are staying in school has increased as well. So we are pleased about that. And I think that we also want to highlight that the all students has increased by 2.5% in that time. So those are some highlights on graduation. I know that there's a lot of conversation within the community with regard to inclusion, which is wonderful. We know that we do have too many students in substantially separate settings and not the appropriate placement. So we want to make sure that we're moving towards inclusion and also making sure students are in the appropriate placement. And I really want to highlight this piece that in 2015 and 2016, the graduation rate for students in full inclusion exceeded the district rate. Okay, that's really exciting and is a testament to the power of inclusion that the graduation rates for students in full inclusion is so high. Okay. Also, the percent of students aged 6 to 21 in full or partial inclusion settings has increased from 53% to 64% over the past 10 years. So while we have a lot of work to do in terms of reducing the amount of students in substantially separate settings and increasing the amount of students in inclusion, the trend lines certainly are moving in the right directions, And lastly, the students in substantially separate settings has decreased from 41% to 29% in that same time between 2010 and 2020. So what are we going to do in terms of building inclusion in Boston? This year, in 2014, there was an initial rollout of rolling out inclusion starting in kindergarten. Those students have now reached grade 7 and is forcing some structural changes in how we allocate resources in really important ways to make sure that resources are hitting students where they're needed. We are also making an investment to support district-wide implementation of this. We worked with 7 schools this year to increase inclusive opportunities. And next school year, we will be increasing that cohort to about 15 schools to work with to increase inclusion in those schools. So, and with that, I think I'm turning it over to Dr. Romero Johnson. Dr. Romero Johnson.
Thank you. Good afternoon, council members. Thank you for having us. I will go into the next stage of recovery and talking about academic acceleration and summer learning. Our aspiration for this summer is that every student will have a plan that includes academics and enrichment opportunities, as well as employment for our high schoolers that seek meaningful internships with our industry partners. Over the years, our team has created innovative and responsive programming, yet last year we pivoted to the remote format and added a significant focus to both the cultural and linguistic relevance in our curricular offerings and a laser focus on priority academic standards. We've addressed the need to have a focused grade level curriculum and assessments and ensuring an intentional instructional bridge between the spring and fall. For summer learning, we are excited to be offering programs for over 16,000 students in July and August. And we have increased our capacity, our overall capacity, as well as the social emotional supports for our students, included embedded training for teachers to support student needs, as well as social workers and school psychologists for tiers 2 and 3 support. Students will have an opportunity to experience hands-on learning and enrichment in person, or can opt in to join remote program if they choose, depending on the program. Next slide. This slide shows a breakdown of the different offerings by number of seats. And then the next slide. This is from last year. Student demographics last summer was representative of our district student population, with our students, Black students making up 38% of the overall enrollment, 44% were Latinx, 8% were white, and 6% Asian. And 44 and 40% were either students with IEPs or English learners, respectively. I will now pass it on to my colleague, Daphne Germain, Assistant Superintendent for the Office of English Learners.
Thank you, Dr. Mara Johnson. Greetings to all elected officials, committee participants who are watching. For this part, I want to frame how I'll be sharing the updates over the next 3 slides. I will be reporting on how OEL invested the fiscal year 21 funds, how we are reimagining the department, and what our priorities will be for fiscal year 22. During the COVID pandemic, the Office of English Learners had to quickly reimagine how to support an already marginalized student population and community. With the funds allocated to us last year, we invested in the purchase of talking points and rolled it out to all schools. Talking points allowed schools to communicate directly with students or parents in their native language. As teachers text in English, the parent is able to receive the message in their preferred language, be it Spanish, Haitian Creole, Cabo Verdean Creole. From September 2020 to April 2021, BPS teachers, administrators, and families have sent over 2 million text messages. 77% of our BPS families have engaged with talking points. School administrators between September and April have sent 10,000 individual messages, over 2,800 announcements reaching 27,000 families. Added to the investment of the online platforms to help students stay engaged, OEL purchased Nearpod and Newsella to help create student-centered virtual platforms for our EL students, and launched a virtual multilingual library as part of our commitment to bilingual resources available to students to celebrate their language and culture. In the midst of the pandemic, we successfully opened up in partnership with the Burke and the Cabo Verdean Center for Applied Research a heritage course and expanded the Haitian and Vietnamese dual language programs. For the health and well-being of our parents and students, we launched a pilot program called Parents Helping Parents, where our EL parents who qualified were hired to provide targeted supports for their peers who were having difficulty accessing the district's online platforms, helping their students with homework, or even knowing how to access their EBT card support. Throughout the year also, we celebrated with them by providing them moments of joy through virtual celebrations of their language, culture, and history. And at this moment, I do have to say Happy Haitian Heritage Month and Happy Asian American Pacific Islander Month. Next slide, thank you. During the pandemic, it has afforded us a rare opportunity where many things that our families were told would be an impossible feat all of a sudden became actualities. In the same vein, OEL continues to believe that what appears impossible for ELs at this point in time is possible for BPS. As requested, we are providing an update on the work of the Look Act in the generating of a new bilingual education plan in regards to Commitment 1.4. In February, under the leadership of Dr. Sylvia Romero Johnson, BPS charged the OEL department with moving forward on the following 4 items. Developing a roadmap that would provide a clear strategic vision for quality education for English learners that aligns to the district goals and incorporates feedback from impacted stakeholders. In April, we launched a Reimagine OEL campaign to elicit input from all our major language communities. We're able to host 9 community engagement sessions in the native language of our community members so that the families could freely speak of what they themselves desired in the educational experience of their children. In partnership with central office teams, OEL began to discuss the implications of implementing these changes, such as the impact to our current assignment policies, practices, and even looking at our WSF structure through an equity lens. Thus far, through weekly meetings and countless conversations, the internal levers that affect funding and assignment are coming to light with a group of individuals who are willing to change the status quo for the sake of ensuring EL families have choice. Lastly, though it looks like a matter of fact goal in regards to the leveraging the racial equity planning tool, as it was mandated by Dr. Caselius, this process continues to be a critical step for any shift that the district wants to do. It has helped us to stay focused on ensuring that an already marginalized group does not remain marginalized any longer. Next slide. To shift and realign to a new reality for global education, we need to consistently look at our funds and identify how we can invest them for a new experience for our students. Many years ago, BPS and the city invested $1 million to create the Translation and Interpretation Unit. As can be seen on this slide, that $1 million investment over time has grown to a $3 million investment. We all can attest how much of a necessity it is for a city that represents a global community to have the supports necessary to communicate to all of its citizens. As OEL is about to step into a new reality, the same level of investment is needed, not just now, but over time to help us sustain the work that will impact 40% of the student population. In that same vein, we want to be able to reorganize the department to align with the vision of the roadmap and prioritize hiring for positions that will support with the implementation of the work at the central level and provide direct school support for implementation for the shifts that will be proposed. As well as shared earlier on, we want to ensure that we are able to develop instructionally sound bilingual materials and assessments for the various languages where communities have requested additional programming. At this time, I turn it over to Nate. Thank you.
Thank you. We just wanted to close by pointing out that all of the information that is being presented today will be posted on our website, translated into the 9 major languages for BPS students and families, as well as more information about our any presentations we did to the school committee and information we post online about our budget. This is the fourth hearing out of many. I don't think I've had the opportunity to edit this calendar since Chairman Bach pointed out that there is another hearing for public testimony on the BPS budget, which we'll be adding to all of our calendars going forward. But please be sure to tune in to learn more as we go through the rest of our strategic plan. With that, I will turn it back over to the chairwoman for questions.
Great, thanks so much, Nate. And since we only had an hour between the two hearings, I think that's fair. I wanted to note that in addition to the colleagues I read earlier, I was also joined early on in the presentation by Councillor Andrea Campbell, District 4, Councillor Matt O'Malley, District 6, and our President Pro Tempore, and Councillor Julia Mejia at large. So I'm going to jump straight to questions. I'll defer mine again to the end. So starting with Councillor Flynn. There he is. Yes, Councillor Flynn, you have the floor.
Thank you, Councilor Bach. Thank you to the BPS team that is here. I guess my questions or comments are regarding the support for students with learning disabilities. I know that parents have been advocating for learning methods such as Orton Gilligan in BPS for students with dyslexia. Is that what is widely used in BPS? If I have the right name, Orton Gillingham in BPS. Do we have any background on that?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Flynn. I'll take that question. I really appreciate that. Yes, the state has come out with new guidance just this spring with regard to dyslexia. We discussed this briefly in the slides, which was that we are increasing the amount that we're spending on making sure that our staff have the training needed in Gorton, Gillingham, and Wilson, which are rules-based reading interventions. We're actually doing something different this year, which is we're doing the training before the year ends so that hopefully we can make sure we get more teachers trained in that so that we don't have to be volunteers over the summer. So we hope that that will increase our expertise in the district in implementing rules-based reading.
Thank you, Ethan. I had an email from a parent was asking me, what type of assistance are we providing students with learning disabilities, learning challenges, and outreach to the parents that don't speak English. And the student is struggling learning English as well. But what is the overall strategy of working closely with the parent, with the child, to make sure we're providing the right resources and support for that student and family member?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Flynn, for that. And I may ask Dr. Romero-Johnson or Ms. Germain to chime in as well, but certainly our Ls with disabilities, so our English learners with disabilities, are unfortunately one of our lowest performing students when it comes to academic achievement. And so it is incumbent on us to work incredibly hard to make sure that they have the language access needed to get the resources that we can provide to them. So a lot of this rests on translation and interpretation, but not only that, it also rests on community engagement and really being relentless in reaching out to them and making sure that families have what they need. As Mr. Germain said, we've been using talking points for translation. I know a lot of coordinators, so team facilitators, use that to make sure that we're getting to the families as much as possible. We also make sure as we have translators at the team meetings themselves. And then I think we also know that we have some work to do in terms of making sure that we have the expertise in the district in terms of identification and understanding the difference between what is actually a disability and what is learning a language, and that we have some work to do in that area, and we're going to engage in that as we move ahead.
And to support with Ethan's response, as he identified, for many of the interpreters who are working within the special ed component, many of them go through training to make sure that they understand the vocabulary and are effectively interpreting for parents. We do receive a lot of feedback. Parents and community advocates who participate in the IEP meetings are able to give us feedback on the experience with the interpreters so that we can adjust. And as Ethan identified, also part of the work we're doing within the roadmap development for the shift in bilingual programming is looking at how to provide access to bilingual special education for students who would qualify for that. So making sure we have the right type of staffing who can speak the languages of the student or the appropriate supports necessary for the students throughout the day. Thank you.
Thank you. And my final question is, can you talk about the process in deciding how to distribute the federal relief funds? I know that there will be a commission or a working group established. What will the membership be like? I know I recommended a parent on the board. I received a letter from the superintendent saying that a parent would be on the board. So thank you for that. But how is the money going to be spent? Who decides where the money is going to be spent? And what input will the public have, or will parents have, or will advocates have?
Yeah, great question. And thank you for the opportunity to kind of clarify around the ESSER Commission. Their first meeting is going to be on Thursday in the evening. Those are all public meetings, and we'll also have public comment. The goal is to make sure that we are listening to the community and hearing feedback on how to use the ESSER funds. The goal is to put together the proposal for the application, which is due at the end of July. In terms of how we're thinking about structuring the spending, of course, part of the requirements of the 20% goes directly to students and academic recovery. But there's a lot of flexibility in how we use the funds. And that's why we've been talking so much about what it means to reimagine the district. As part of the commission, we'll be talking about both what are the needs that the community recognizes, what are the needs of our students and schools. How do we structure the spending over time? We have 3 years to spend the $400 million, so that allows us to sort of smooth the spending over multiple years and not ramp up too much spending. And then because this is a budget hearing, I'll go ahead and put in a plug. We really need to be thinking about the long-term sustainability. If we were to use this to ramp up staff and build new programs without a plan for sustainability, we could be creating a fiscal cliff for us as a district. And so those will be the part of the public process. You should invite people to attend the ESSER attend the ESSER Commission meetings and provide their feedback to us.
Thank you, Nathan. That's good information, but who makes the decision on where the money is spent? I want to know who the head honcho is of who makes the decision. That's the person we want to talk with to make sure that the money is spent equally. So who is that person?
Yeah, ultimately, I believe that the superintendent will be, finalizing the application in consultation with the ESSER Commission. And so, the buck literally stops there. As you know, all federal funding does need to be voted on and approved as an accept and expend from the school committee as well. So from a mechanics perspective, the school committee will have oversight in terms of sort of approving. And then there's a lot of oversight, again, because we do have to apply through the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, the State Department of Education, that they will be reviewing our application as well. But as you know, in Boston, there's multiple levels of autonomy and the way that we allocate funds out to schools and the way that we design programs. And while what we try and do as a district is really maintain equity and be able to monitor across and ensure that we provide resources to the students who need it the most, while also maintaining some flexibility and autonomy for those who are closest to the students, who know their students the best, to be able to do that. And I think as we think about consistency, equity, and achievement, we need to really be looking across the buckets and figure out the best mechanisms. But this is a huge opportunity with $400 million in new funding, but it's also one that we need to be really deliberate about, because otherwise we'll find ourselves not having the outcomes that we need starting this year, but certainly at the end of the 3 years.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you to the BPS team. Thank you, Councilor Buck.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. And yeah, I've certainly asked the BPS team also to make sure that the council gets more insight as this commission continues on specifically the money to be spent in the next fiscal year prior to us taking our budget votes. So we're looking forward to digging in a bit more on that. Next up, sorry, I don't have my list up in front of me. Next up is Councillor Asabi George, and then it'll be Councillor Flaherty, and I'll send the councillors the order. Councillor Asabi George.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And Ethan, if we could just go have a little bit more of an expanded conversation around the sub-separate classrooms in BPS, as this is certainly a budget hearing, and we're talking about planned spending for FY22, so school year 21-22. And I recognize that sub-separate classrooms are very expensive, but they are certainly a needed resource for many of our students. But it does appear that disproportionately we admit or enroll or assign a high number of Black and brown boys in particular to sub-separate classrooms. So I know it was part of your presentation, but if we could just talk a little bit in greater detail around sub-separate classrooms. How do we work to limit those assignments? And how do we make sure that we are truly supporting kids in the least restrictive environment for their academic well-being and achievement? So I guess what's the dollar amount that we're spending? How many students are in sub-separate classrooms? And what's the work before us to limit that assignment to best serve our kids?
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Asabi George. I really appreciate the question. As you know, this is what I'm passionate about and really care about, and and have already also learned a lot about this in the new role. And I want to say to begin with, what we want to make sure is that students are in the appropriate placement, right? That is the least restrictive environment, is the appropriate placement. And as you noted, sometimes that is a substantially separate classroom, and that is where students can be best served for them. Data would certainly indicate that that is not always happening in Boston, as we have 2.5 times the national average of students in substantially separate settings. We're not the highest in Massachusetts when you compare us to other major cities. But we are extremely high. I'll have to get you exact numbers in terms of the exact enrollment in substantially separate classrooms, but I can tell you that it is 2.5 times the national average and 2.5 times just about the state average as well, and can get you comparative numbers to other cities in Massachusetts also. We, in particular, we are concerned about the assignment of Black and brown boys to substantially separate classrooms for students with emotional impairments. And so that will be one of our 5 strategic goals for the Office of Special Education. We'll be addressing both the identification and programming for students with emotional impairments. I think it's important to point out that this is not that they come from general education classrooms. Those students come from general education classrooms. So part of the solution here is addressing general education supports as well. And so we will be looking at that as one of our goals.
Can I just, if I could add to that, just on the budget side, we would have to pull the exact spending. We were just looking at, it's actually not something we report separately. We tend to report our budget based on spending by disability group, not by setting. We have about, as of October 1, about 3,200 students that were in substantially separate classrooms. And there are some groups for whom that is the sort of peak enrollment. And in some groups that is the sort of, as the year grows, we see an increase, most notably the early childhood students. We are projecting level special education programming. In terms of funding, you mentioned that it is more expensive. We spend a lot of money on substantially separate. I would just point out that one of the things that we do in weighted student funding is we fund the students based on their disability, their need, not based on their setting. And so a student who's in a substantially separate on a per pupil basis is getting the same funding as somebody in an inclusive setting. And we do that to make sure students will move into the appropriate setting. And then starting 2 years ago, we added an additional inclusion weight. What we wanted to do was provide additional supports to students in inclusive settings. And then also make sure that there was the sort of financial incentives were aligned with our academic incentives, what we're trying to achieve academically. And so we actually make an investment. We spend slightly more for the students who are moving to inclusive settings. And that is part of, I think Daphne mentioned this already, talking about looking at weighted student funding across English learners. We're also going to look at weighted student funding across special education to say, what are innovative ways that we can fund to meet the needs of students so that we don't get locked into this setting-based decision-making as opposed to really services-based. And to the extent that I know what I'm talking about, I have to give credit, of course, to Ethan, Sylvia, and Daphne for their patience in explaining it to me.
No, I appreciate that. And I appreciate that it's part of your strategic goals, and always want to make sure, always the priority is to make sure students are in the placement that is best suited for them. But when we, learn of 2.5 times the national average, 2.5 times the state average, we may have a higher percentage of students who require special education services than relative districts across the Commonwealth, for example. But when we look at the national average, it could be that we're doing things better here in Boston and that we're recognizing and identifying students who require additional services or special education services, again, relative to other parts of the country, but still 2.5 times seems disproportionate. So want to make sure that we are, certainly educating our kids, in the most appropriate way to sort of, help them succeed and achieve academically as well as socially and emotionally. I see the gavel. I'll save the rest of my questions for the next round. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Sabi-George. Next up is Councillor Flaherty, and then it'll be Councillor Braden. Councillor Flaherty. Actually, oh no, he's there. Councillor Flaherty.
Yes, Madam Chair, just having some technical difficulties. So if I fade off, just somehow give me the signal, and I might have to actually reboot. But first of all, it's great to see Ethan. We go back a lot of years, over 20 years, and no one has been committed to this issue more so than you have. So I'm so happy to see the improvements in the graduation rates for students with disabilities. The percentage of students aged 6 to 21 in full or partial inclusion settings has increased significantly over the last 10 years. And I know that you have been a moving force in that. So always great to see you and appreciate your commitment and partnership with our city. Wanted to see if you can just touch base and explain the targeted investments that will help accelerate our progress in this space. And what is the target goal to decrease the percentage of students in substantially separated settings in the school year?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Flaherty, and thank you for your commitment as well over the many years, and appreciate that. Know that we're all trying to create a better city here. In terms of the targeted investments, I think, we are looking forward to that ESSER Commission getting to work and really being able to target into the right things. Certainly, there are a lot of options on the table. There are a lot of different ideas that are being put out by both the community and also that we have internally and are really excited about. Obviously, those things in terms of the ESSER funding can't be finalized until the work of the commission happens, but I'd be shocked if it didn't include more work towards inclusion, more support for rules-based reading, and some version of tutoring somewhere along the line. So we will be looking at those things, but obviously unable to finalize those things until we have ESSER, the ESSER Commission up and running and starting to make concrete recommendations for those sections. In terms of specific inclusion goals, we wanted to make sure strategically that we were directionally correct, and we have not set those specific targets yet, but we certainly will be as we get there. One of the things I just want to mention, as we worked with 7 schools this year, and that work is not done with those 7 schools, we will continue to work with them. And the next cohort of schools, some of them will be one-year projects, some of them will be multi-year projects. Building inclusion in schools takes both mindset change and structural change, and so it takes time. And we want to make sure it's done right. We want to make sure we get people on board to make sure our kids are served in the best possible way in the least restrictive setting. So in terms of a specific goal, I will get back to you, but we will be working with between 15 and 20 schools next year on this project.
Thank you, Ethan. And I trust your judgment there. What will the public engagement listening sessions look like for ESSER funds? I've heard a variety of stakeholders with some shared concerns that parents' voices may not be heard during that process. And as chair of the Committee on COVID-19 Relief, I'm committed to hosting a public process for this funding in addition to the public engagement process that the BPS hosts. So I'll be working closely with the chair of Ways and Means here as the budget process concludes, and also the chair of Education as we move forward. But I just want to make sure that I get that in, that there are some stakeholders that do have concerns that parents, their voices may not be heard in the process, and just want to make sure we can nip that early in the process and make sure that they do have a voice. There are consumers, obviously, the parents of the students, and so we need to hear from them.
Ethan, I think I'm going to jump in on this one. Counselor, thank you for that question. And I think that this continues to be, something that's on the top of everybody's mind. This is significant funding, as Nate has said, that we're receiving as a district. What I'm going to do is email out to all the counselors, and I would encourage you to share it with your constituents as well. Certainly something that we've been promoting online and trying to encourage folks to come to. So we do have these 5 public meetings that we're hosting with the commission that's going to be making recommendations to the superintendent. And we really would like the community to come to those meetings, hear what's being discussed, and also provide input during the public comment period that will follow each meeting. There are also going to be meetings that we're hosting with a number of different stakeholders. So I think there will be lots of information coming out this Thursday at that first meeting, really around multiple ways that people can engage. And then we also have the 30-day review and public comment period. So I think it's similar to what folks have seen with school committee, what you see with city council, hearings and meetings where there is a public process where people can watch and learn and hear and listen to what's being discussed, and then make comments and engage with that. So no decisions have been made. I want to be very clear about that. I think there's lots of great ideas that are being discussed both, here, school communities, families, right? There is no shortage of good ideas, which is awesome. And we want people to provide that feedback.
Okay. Thank you, Megan. What interventions do we have planned for our special education learners in ELL this upcoming summer? I'd just like to get a clear snapshot as to what the summer plan is. And, to me, part of our reimagining plan, it's tied in with the district strategic plan and commitment number 6. So I guess what are our plans for the summer, and how are we utilizing our partners in higher education and philanthropy and workforce development to help us make this the most enrichful summer for our youth as possible?
Yes, certainly I can speak from the special education perspective, but I know we'll be hearing more about summer in in a bit from, or we can from Dr. Romero Johnson about the overall summer plan. But with regard to special education, we will be running ESY as we always do, but it will be more robust this year. We'll have both the opportunity for virtual ESY as well as in-person ESY. We're glad to be able to offer the in-person option. Also, we will be laying over on top of ESY compensatory services for those families that have reached agreements. And so there will be a lot of services delivered that way as well that are very individualized and targeted to what the student needs. And those too can be offered both in person and virtually. So logistically and operationally, we have quite a summer, but we do think that we will be able to offer specialized services to the students in the ways that they need. So we're looking forward to that.
And if I could just sneak one more question in, what data do we have on our English language learning students in the challenge that they had to face this year due to COVID? Do we have any hard, clear-cut data?
Yes, we do have hard data in terms of students who've been impacted. The data that we are tracking are students' attendance, students' participation on the virtual platforms that have been provided. We're actually on Thursday, we'll be launching a task force for school reopening with the very focus in mind of how do we begin to integrate and how do we begin to prepare intervention supports to be integrated into both summer and the academic year for next year for our EL students, looking at primarily students who are at the high school level, who are at risk for dropout, who have low attendance rates, students who may have not participated in any of the district's assessment platforms. Those are the data metrics that we're tracking for our EL population.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's it for this round for me.
Great, thank you, Councillor Flaherty. And I do want to note that we were joined a while back by Councillor Edwards, Councillor Lydia Edwards of District 1 as well. Next going to Councillor Braden, and then I think it'll be Councillor Campbell. Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a few questions. First of all, how many students go out of district and what sort of budget is for out of district placement? And then to look at the enrollment at the Horace Mann, it had a precipitous drop in enrollment over several years. And I just wanted to know, to get some insight into what was going on, that why our deaf school population had enrollment had decreased and so dramatically and so quickly. And the numbers of students that were out of district, students that maybe went elsewhere, or just to get some sense of what was going on there. And then the Horace Mann is a dual language school. If deaf students don't go to Horace Mann and they go to other schools, are their peers taught ASL so that they can communicate with their deaf peers? I know in some schools in the UK, for example, the peers are taught ASL so that the deaf students are able to communicate with their peers in sign language. And then also at the Edison School, they had a really successful behavior support program that was enabling students with behavioral challenges to help manage their stress levels and adapt their behavior so that they could be reintegrated into a regular classroom again. And I just wanted an update on how that was going. I know we've had COVID for years, so I'd just like an update on how that's going. Are we able to pick it up where we left off after COVID? And then I had a question in this morning's session about related service providers with regard to students who are not enrolled in BPS, but who are eligible to receive services from our related service providers. I'm just curious to know how much money that budget is and what are the challenges of delivering services to students who are not enrolled in BPS. and we have a significant population out here in Alston Brighton that it goes to Jewish day schools. I know that constituents have asked me about these issues with regard to related service providers outside of the BPS. And that's a handful of questions. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Braden. That's a good, rich list. I'll try and keep it concise. In terms of our out-of-district students, we have about 450 students, 454 this year is the number of students that we serve that have what we call out-of-district placements. And in terms of the budget, we can get you a number on that. We don't have that right now because it's actually fairly complicated because we're fiscally responsible for some, but not every single one. So in terms of what the actual BPS expenditure is, we will have to get back to you on that. But it is about 450 students and it's hovered about that. We have some people expected to see that number go up during the pandemic. We have not seen that happen yet. So that's actually a good thing. We want to be serving our students within the district, no question about that. With regard to Horace Mann and enrollment, again, that's an extremely complicated question. I think there's a lot of things at play there, but certainly enrollment has gone down over the years, over the past 5 years. I think it began about 5 years ago, if my memory serves me correctly. And I think one of the things that is at play here is that, the most important thing in this dynamic is that families have choice, right? That a family makes a decision about what they want for their child. Some families prefer to have the dual language experience that you described, and some families prefer to have the inclusion experience that they can have someplace else where they may not have the dual language experience. We, as a district, want to make sure that we are transparent as possible about making sure we give the family the opportunity to make that choice for them. That they can make that choice for their child. That's really what is most important. In terms of the ASL being taught in the non-Horace Mann settings, no, they are not taught the ASL, because ASL, as you described, that is a dual language program at the Horace Mann School. And so their students are all learning ASL. In our other settings, and a lot of this has to do with hearing technology, right, and cochlear implants. And as that technology gets better, more students are having opportunities to access different educational environments. And so that has changed the dynamic substantially here. You also brought up the Edison School. I know that they've been working really hard in there and made a lot of headway in their, what we call their EI strand, their program for students with emotional impairments, and that they do give those students opportunities for inclusion, which is fantastic. I don't know the latest on them, but I do know that they've been working hard at it, and it's a stable program and is successful in terms of giving those students opportunities for inclusion, which is really exciting. So that's a really important initiative that you're doing there. And then lastly, on what you describe as students in private schools who need IEP services. This is actually, you've asked a couple of very complicated questions, but this one is and has been an area of learning for me with regard to what's called proportionate share spending. Those are federal funds that come into the district. Those are not state funds. We have a whole process we go through where we do something called child find. And then we count the number of students in all the schools that may need services, and then we allocate those funds on the basis of how many students are in each school. And then based on those funds, we actually give service time of BPS employees in those schools. So it's a relatively complicated process that we go through to make sure that those students get the services in those schools. I do want to add that there is also always the possibility, if a student wants to receive IEP services in the public school setting, but they go to a private school, they may do that. So they may say, I have an IEP and I'd like to have my IEP services met at the Orenburger school. They may come to the Orenburger school and get those services. Not just the Orenburger, any public school. We're required to offer those services.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a very comprehensive list. Madam Chair, do you mind if I have one more question?
Well,
I know you're waving your shillelagh over there.
if it's quick, Councillor Braden.
Just a quick one. I noticed in your out of district placement graph that you had that the white male and female students had a higher a higher percentage of out of district placements. I just wonder, is there any reason why that would be?
Excellent question, and something that we look at closely is what the demographics of our students in all settings are, including out of district placements. And so there are, again, lots of factors that could be leading to that, but certainly something that we are aware of and looking at and trying to understand why that might be happening.
Very good. Madam Chair, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Councillor Braden. Next up is Councillor Campbell, and then I think it'll be Councillor O'Malley. Councillor Campbell, you have the floor.
Thank you, and I apologize earlier. I was trying to multitask a hearing and a doctor's appointment, and they didn't care about the BPS budget hearing, so I had to tune off, but my Chief of Staff, Ellie, was on, so I took a lot of notes, and I can just follow up with questions. So thank you, Madam Chair, and of course, thank you to everyone from BPS and administration for the presentation earlier, and for this one as well. I'll just quickly jump in. I know that soon the gavel will come up. Federal dollars, I too, of course, have been hearing from constituents who want to be actively involved in that process. Going to continue to put a plug in for just the infrastructure cases. Parents who really want to see, of course, learning environments and school buildings be improved. And of course, the federal dollars are an opportunity to do that with sort of one-time investment, but long-term effect. So just wanted to plug that. We'll stay in contact with folks with respect to the federal dollars. I have some questions with respect to parents and teachers who have concerns about the lack of clarity and the level of inconsistency regarding inclusion classrooms. So Ethan, I appreciate some of the comments you've already made. I know you get this just based on your work in the district. But some of the questions are, what standards are in place for the district's approach to inclusion classrooms? How many different models are there and how are they distributed across the district? What can we do to better support families who are new to special education to help them navigate the spectrum of options and models that are available? So that's one set of questions. And then the second set of questions have to do with the work of our Office of English Learners. And I know there was a lot of in the presentation on engagement, of course, important planning processes, but can we also have you speak to just where we are in implementing the Look Act and reimagining the Office of English Learners? What's the current capacity and number of staff at OEL? And to what extent is the team in charge of translation, interpretation, versus sort of the broader planning for EL support and of course school level support? I would love some more details there, as well as there was a point in the presentation around the shift for K-6 assignments for English learners to increase access to bilingual programming. Can you speak to just a little bit more of what that actually means in practice? Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Councillor Campbell. Nice to see you. Appreciate the questions, certainly on inclusion. Speak to a couple of things on the inclusion piece on the models. So I think that you know, having created a model of inclusion at a school and having seen others be developed over time, The most important thing is the school creating a model that works in their local environment, right? And that it is driven by the IEP services that the students need, right? And that is taken into account. We need to create models that will allow us to provide the continuum of services that all our students need. One piece I would highlight is that not only are we high on percentage of students in substantially separate settings, we're also extremely low actually on the number of students in partial inclusion settings. And so in this learning that we've done with the 7 schools this year, and we'll do with the about 15 schools next year, we're hoping we'll be looking at these models and learning what is most effective. We also, it's worth saying, we're not starting from zero. We have a lot of inclusion models in place already. The Henderson, the Lyon, the Haley, the Manning, there are a lot of them, and we need to be learning from them and looking at what those outcomes are as well, and what is actually working for our students and families. And so we want to build on that learning and continue to build those models. I think it is worth pointing out that the issues of equity around inclusion and who has access to inclusion seats and making sure that there is not disproportionality there as well. We want to make sure that our Black and Brown families have access to those inclusion seats to the same degree that our white families do. And that is incredibly important. And that's a structural issue that we're going to have to look at over time. And I think actually I would also add that, you asked about this as well, that the community engagement piece of that and educating the community on the benefits of inclusion and also understanding what the appropriate services are for each child, and your child in particular are, and where they can be most well served is going to be incredibly important. So, but happy to follow up on any more specifics with regard to that. But that's an initial answer. I'll pass it over to Ms. Germain.
Thank you so much, Ethan. And thank you, Councillor Campbell, for your questions in regards to the needs of our English learner population. In regards to the Look Act in of itself is a broader policy by the state that has about 12 components to it. Since the Look Act was passed, the district has moved forward to implement many aspects of the components. For instance, the seal of biliteracy, we are in our 3rd year of implementation. And this year, despite COVID, we have at least 11 of our high schools that are actually testing students to qualify them for the seal of biliteracy this year. And we're looking to see an increase in the number of students who are graduating with the seal of biliteracy. The other part of the Look Act is programming. And right now, for the last 3 months, as we've shared, we've been engaging with our communities to be able to get feedback, to learn what is it that parents want. And what we continue to hear over and over again, parents want access to bilingual programming. They want access to services that value their culture and their language, so that they can continue to share forth from one generation to another. Grandmother can speak to their child and the child can speak back to the grandmother. In regards to that plan, we are in the final stages to be able to present the plan to senior leadership in BPS, so that by, I think our initial due date was to be able to present by the end of May, this vision of bilingual education. The additional question that you asked in terms of the practical steps in regards to this shift, one of the things, if you're familiar, currently the district offers 6 different programmings for ELs, of which one of them we allow for the assigning of students by language and ELD level. So if you are a student in need of more intensive support for language acquisition, you are assigned to a Spanish program or Haitian Creole program, a Cabo Verdean Creole program at the K6 level to be clustered. But what we've heard both from our schools as well as from our parents in our community, at times these program structures are not necessarily sustainable, or that they are unable to find seats if they desire to be part of these programs. And so what is being proposed is to look at the system in a way where, like general education, that we are able to assign our students to programs without having to limit access, which is a radical shift that will require a different perspective of how we service our bilingual students, not necessarily waiting for them to acquire language, English as a language in order for them to access the general ed classroom, but looking at the general ed classroom in of itself as a place where all students can learn language. I am of Haitian descent, and I share that if my son, when he goes to a school, he should be able to sit in a general ed classroom and be able to learn English and learn Haitian Creole. And so that shift in model is one of the things that we are proposing within the K-6 vision for this work. In regards to our staffing capacity, can share that information with you at a later time. We are reviewing our staff. We're looking at the big asks within the roadmap, where we are looking to invest some additional dollars and additional resources to support our EL population that are more at risk. And so we would need to recalibrate our teams to make sure that we have the appropriate staffing to support those needs. So right now we're going through a process of looking at current supports, current fundings, to see what we can leverage, and then to partner with our other colleagues on the budget side to ensure that we are adequately staffed for future need. Thank you.
Thank you all. Is there a number in terms of the number of folks right now in the office?
We're staffed at about 45 staff.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Councilor Bach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilor Campbell, and we'd love to get follow up on those numbers when you guys have updated ones.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Campbell. Next up is, Councilor O'Malley, and then it'll be Councilor Mejia, and then Councilor Edwards. Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And also thank you to Councilor Braden, who I don't want this to be lost, but noted that the Beacon Hill City Councilor has a shillelagh. So I am wanted to echo her correct terminology of your gavel, Madam Chair. Great to see you all, Mr. DB particularly. It's great to see you, my dear friend and partner at the mighty Manning School while you are no longer principal, and next year I will no longer be counselor. I trust we have been grandfathered in as judges for the Burger Slam to support that wonderful little school on Moss Hill. Wanted to just begin, several colleagues had mentioned something that I will also mention, which I know you've heard at school committee and otherwise, is the criticism, some warranted in my opinion, that the whole sort of COVID funding committee does not as best represent the BPS community as many of us would like. So I take you all at your word that this is going to be an organization that really helps facilitate some good and honest give and take, and we'll continue to do that. And from my vantage point, I created the COVID funding committee, which will also be an extra set of eyes and direct oversight of that going forward. So I wanted to raise that issue. Next, I wanted to again acknowledge the great work that I think BPS has had to do in such a challenging time. And so I'll get right into it with the question. One question I often ask at this particular budget hearing is the number of sort of unfilled or unclosed, or I'm not sure what the exact terminology is, but IEPs that yet haven't been sort of at least closed in terms of putting the plan in place. They're typically, and to BPS's credit, there's been a better job of making sure that every student that needs an IEP at least gets that initial meeting and some initial services. That must be so challenging when everything is remote. So I don't know, even if this is you or Daphne, can you just talk about, did we see an increase in IEPs this year? Do we have, are there some that we were unable to facilitate well because of restrictions with COVID? If either of you want to jump in there, please do. I think you're muted, Ethan.
Thank you, Councilor O'Malley. I think I get it by now. But also look for Burger Slam and also Spelling Bee. Hope to see
exactly.
One of the Certainly, it has been a challenge reaching compliance. There's no question about that. But I think in one regard, we've worked really hard to make sure that families are getting what they need, particularly with regard to early childhood. So we opened up the Endicott building to be an early childhood testing center, and that has allowed us to really make sure that the vast majority of our early childhood students are getting what they need. One of the challenges in the testing piece is lots of families have said we don't want to get tested until we're back in person. So there was a delay there, and we figured out. So some of this was not just like, hey, you didn't do it. It was also like this was family choice. And so we are still catching up with the numbers, but not surprisingly, our compliance numbers probably are not going to be as good this year as we wish they would be. But
and I just want to be clear that the question wasn't meant at a criticism in any sense. It was underscoring just a challenge that people may not think of as it relates to returning to school.
No, really appreciate that. And really the testing is the piece that is hard, right? And not to get too detailed, but in particular academic testing, which usually the special education teacher does, because they're remote. So they can't just go and pick the kid up and take them down to their classroom and test them during lunch, right? So catching up to the academic testing in particular has been hard. Related services and psychologists and ABA teams have been really excellent about trying to get up as much as possible and keep up, but the academic testing has been hard, which then makes it hard to get to the IEP meeting because you need all the testing to be able to get to the IEP meeting. So it is a complicated set of issues, but I, as well as you, want to credit our entire team throughout BPS for trying to do their best in a really tough situation.
Do we anticipate, and this could be, I guess, conjecture, but I assume the answer is yes, that's why I'm asking it, anticipate an increased number of students who may need an IEP next year as we return back from a hybrid or mostly remote or an all remote school year?
It's going to be very hard to tell because you don't want to label learning loss as a disability. Right. And so if there are things that we can do to support students and get them get the right recovery things in place, then hopefully we won't have to move to an IEP because it's not a disability, right? If you can catch them up. But that obviously can also be a gray area because you got to, families, it gets tricky. So I think it would not be surprising if it happened, but I also want to make sure that we don't, this goes back to the conversation with Counselor Asabi George around appropriate placement. The ultimate goal is to make sure the student is getting the right services in the right setting. And that could be the general education environment. It could be a substantially separate room. And what the services in particular are. So I've seen a couple of, our coordinators have done a nice job reminding people that, look, now that they're back in person, just because they're a little bit behind doesn't mean you automatically need to go through with the testing process. Let's do some response to intervention. Let's put some things in place, and then let's see how they do. Give it a little bit of time. We need to be patient.
I think patience is key, but also obviously being nimble if the needs arrive early on, which I know
absolutely.
You and I would just argue, and I think the answer is the same as it relates to ELL students, many of whom so much of their proficiency comes with going to a school, eating lunch with friends, riding a bus together, which is something that students have obviously lost out on. So I would think that that's another area, and I'll be candid, I've been, critical of BPS in the past, will be critical of BPS in the future. One thing that I want to ensure is that our ELL students and our special needs students have all the funding and the supports. I know that's something we all agree, but particularly transitioning back into, we hope, fully remote and a much safer environment. So I know you're committed to doing everything you can, that your entire team is. So thank you for that. And you may have gone over this in the presentation. I apologize if you did. How many, have we seen any trends with out of district placement in terms of the number of students?
We did. We just reviewed that with Counselor Braden just briefly, but no, the number has not changed dramatically, as you might have expected. We're still hovering right around still hovering right around 450 students in out-of-district placements. It's 454, but we've been as high as 475 over the past few years. So we have not seen an explosion in that.
And what's the dot? And just so my colleagues, particularly the newer ones, know, it's an eye-popping number because many students, the per pupil allocation can be in the six figures for something like that. But
Sure.
what's the money allocated for those 400 and some odd students?
So in the issue, we'll need to get back to you on the exact number, because for many of those students, sometimes we are the fiscally responsible and sometimes we're not, depending on who's involved with the total placement. So we actually need to get into the details on that budget piece there.
Fair point. And then, but we can expect that, I assume.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. As well.
And I would just say on the out-of-district placements, we actually have a surprisingly low percentage given the size of our district. So when you compare us to other major districts, our percentage of students in out-of-district placements is lower on a percentage basis.
Sure. And you and I have talked about this before. I think Dr. Carol Johnson deserves a lot of credit for that. She is someone who focused, my first superintendent, to get that number low. And then how many out of district students are we serving in BPS? That's something that that's more of a allow you to brag. So there are certain students that we can only service from outside. Do we know that number offhand?
I don't. You mean as in like sort of the way we tuition kids into Horace Mann or that kind of thing? Yes. I don't know the number offhand. Horace Mann, I think, has must be about 45 or something like that. I don't know the exact number. But yeah, it's a credit to the programming at Horace Mann, no question about it.
Absolutely. Okay, that is all for this round, Madam Chair. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
If I could just quickly, as a moment to opine as well, the other thing that happened with the charter school funding, and these are Commonwealth charters, that is a different change that's happened over the last 2 years, is that if a student with disabilities enrolls in a Horace Mann, into a Commonwealth charter, and that charter school cannot serve them appropriately and they come back to BPS, we can now bill that charter school for that student. And this was a big move both for accountability for the charter schools and also a big funding equity, because as you know, the funding formula for Commonwealth charters does not appropriately take into account level of need for students with disabilities. And this was a big change. So we're now in the experience where we are in some ways tuitioning in students from Commonwealth charters because they do not have the expertise in programming to meet the needs of students. So I just wanted to jump in on that because it's a moment to brag a little bit about our services.
No, I'm glad you did, Nate. And I think not only to your point, does it fairly return the money, because of course the money should follow the student, but I would venture a guess you will see fewer number of students leave charter schools to return to traditional public schools. So thank you for bringing up that point. It's an excellent one. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor O'Malley. And now going to Councillor Mejia.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. Again, Nate, good to see you. Round two. Okay, so just really quick, I do have a comment and then I have some questions. You know, in my role when I worked in the education space with parents, one of the things that I often hear is that families are always fighting for services, for special education services that their students were written up for their IEPs, but just what is on paper, usually those services are not rendered, and oftentimes they end up having to sue the district just for those services. So I'm just curious about how these dollars are matching up for the deliverables that said IEP has been written up to detail. Like your child is gonna get X, Y, and Z. But when it's time for the implementation of those IEPs, oftentimes parents have had to fight for those services. So can you help us understand why parents are fighting the district to get the services that the budget has allowed for, and why these discrepancies?
Yeah, thank you, Councilor Mejia, for your question. Certainly, we don't want families fighting for services. We want families getting and students getting the right services. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, of course it does. And we want to limit that and make sure that students students and families together are getting the services they need. And there's a reason it's called the IEP team. We hope that it's a team that can work through what individual students need so they get what they do. There's no question that there are times when there are disagreements, and one good thing about special education is there are procedures to go through when you get to those disagreements. That being said, it's not a place we want to end up in. And so we're working hard to work collaboratively with our families so that they do get what they need.
That's great. And I appreciate that. But that doesn't address the point that we've had families that have left the district because we have failed their students. And there needs to be some level of accountability when we're getting paid for services that have not been rendered. And so I would like at some point for us to have a full audit of how frequent this happens. And I do believe while a lot of these things are falling under education, I'm beginning to see this more as a civil rights issue. And I think that we are on the verge of finding ourselves in, hot water, if you will, if we continue to disregard these services. And I mean, people are leaving our district. And I think we need to be more mindful of that. So let me just go into my questions. So one thing that a number of parents have made very clear, which is what I was talking about, is the critical need to see greater funding for special education. However, we're seeing cuts to SPED, early childhood education, SPED lab, and SPED programs for the physically disabled. What are the reasons for this cut? If there's a need, why are we cutting in these spaces? How are we utilizing the new federal funding specifically to offer support to EL students and special education students? And I want very details, like as specific as you can be, would be really helpful. We're seeing a 9% cut to Bilingual Education Administration. Can you talk to us about the reason for this cut? We're seeing a 25% reduction in full-time staff for summer session programming. How are we ensuring that every student who needs it will have access to a quality summer review program? In regards to the Talking App Point, which is a great idea, how many parents are currently enrolled in that program, and what are we doing to expand these kind of services? And how are we thinking about using new technology to reach out to other parents who are historically hard to reach? I'm thinking specifically of our parents who are unhoused. And then I just think it's important for us to really be super mindful that when we're talking about inclusion, we're failing to provide specific guiding principles and standards for inclusion models. Schools cannot do it alone. And so if we don't think about this, we're going to be, continue to be inequitable. So if you could talk to me about that as well.
Yeah, I'll just start by addressing the first question about specific plans for English learners and students with disabilities as it relates to ESSER funding. We're not at the point yet where we have the level of detail to be able to provide. Obviously, a big focus of this has been a commitment to do specialized student supports, and in particular, making sure that we have summer programming available to all students who want it. And so the team has been working very closely. They can fill you in on details about that. That will be a mix of federal funding, federal relief funds, and city funds. But at this point, we're still in the initial phases of doing the planning as part of the ESSER Commission. And as Megan mentioned earlier, related to how that commission will work, there will be a 30-day comment period once we have sort of put forth our public proposals on that. For the other parts of the question, I don't know if Daphne or Ethan, you wanted to weigh in on the question.
Ethan, I can give you a rest.
Go ahead, Daphne. Go.
You're on a roll. So thank you. I do have some additional responses for Councilor Flaherty and Councilor Campbell for the questions that they asked, but I'll start with Councilor Mejia. In regards to the platforms, looking at the data, what we're seeing is 77%. So right now, what I can see within the data is a majority of our parents are using the platform, our EL parents. The majority of them are using it through text, 77%, while the other 23% are using it through the parent app that is downloaded. Right now, we have about 27,000 parents who are currently registered on the Talking Points app. You are absolutely correct in terms of leveraging additional platforms to do engagement for our parents. Through our EL parent team, we have, for different communities, we found that they are also coordinating themselves around different apps for communication purposes within the district. For the Chinese community, we use the WeChat. For the Hispanic as well as the Haitian community, we've used WhatsApp to be able to do additional outreach to them, as well as the standard district messenger text that they may receive. But what we find that as parents coalesce around different needs, they form their own community groups. And part of the work for our EL parent specialist is that they are supporting to make sure that the message from the district goes directly to where the parents themselves are congregating. It is easy to set up a meeting and invite them to a session, but it is harder work to be able to go find them where they are at, and we are committed to doing the harder work within the Office of English Learners.
Daphne, I'm sorry, because I see the gavel and I still have 3 questions that have not been answered. And not to cut you off, but I just think that, 7 minutes is I know, Councilor Bach, we try to stay within that time, but there's just so many questions that we have in regards to this budget. And I just think that we need to come more prepared, not just with the questions that we have, but, I'm going to encourage the BPS team to really think about how we can answer these questions with a little bit more precision, I guess, if you will, because otherwise I'm going to miss out on the opportunity to get through all of my questions. And then I don't want Daphne to use my time to answer Flynn's and Flaherty's questions. I just
no, that we won't do. That we'll give to others. But I would also just say, Councilor Mejia, that we will, I can do a 3rd set of questions from you. It's just a question of courtesy to everybody, right? So yeah, we all have an infinite number of things that we'd like to
so I think what I'm going to do the next time is I'm going to go to the questions that I want to make sure that you guys respond to, and then I'm just going to be a little bit more aggressive of how I go about getting these answers.
But in the meantime, I'm happy to give a little bit of extra time for Daphne and Ethan to finish with the questions that you did ask. And then I'm going to go, but just a couple, because Councilor Edwards has her video on, so go.
Yeah, there was one question in particular around special education cuts around early childhood and physical disabilities, I think you had referenced. We did more this year to support schools and stabilize programming across. And so I'm not, there were no cuts to specific programs. On occasion, there may be adjustments that are made for our reserves for students who are anticipated to be enrolled. This is often a place where we hold a reserve at this point in the year for early childhood special education so that we can monitor the number of new students. But there were no cuts to school-based programs that I'm aware of. So if we reference a document where you saw the cuts, I can go back and investigate more fully to make sure I'm not missing anything. But
go ahead, bring that gavel in, Bach. I see you.
All right, great. We'll come back to you in the next round, Councilor Mejia. And Daphne, I'll get those answers from you just after I let Councilor Edwards go, if that's all right. Thanks so much. Councilor Edwards, you have the floor.
Thank you. I just want to hone in specifically on my district. So you may not have all these answers, but before I go in there, could you just educate me on what's your trigger for when languages are added or not in the ELL programs? Is there a population percentage that's required, and is it city-based or is it neighborhood-based?
That's a very good question. Per DESTI, it starts really at the school level. If 20 parents within a school who speak another language want to organize together, they can make the request to the district to ask for a language-based program. And once that request is received, what we would then do is assess what would be the best way in order to implement a language-based program within that school, depending on the grade clustering of the students, whether it is bringing in before school, after school support, or actually implementing a full formal program within a school. But it starts at the school level. If we get a request that is more district-wide, similar, we would go through a process of assessing where we would see a cluster of students to be able to sustain a classroom, if it's at the elementary level, or a high school or middle school where we would be able to offer maybe a course or two to initiate the programming for the family. But per the Look Act does give the parents the power to make the request to the district and for us to review. Whether it is school-based, region-wide, or city-wide really depends on the number or preponderance of families or within that community that would be eligible for the program.
So in my district, then I've seen some significant decreases in ELL students enrollment. And so one, how are you tracking these students, where they are, and if they'll be coming back? Two, if I see your assessment for how you add languages, but do you have the same kind of assessment for if you're taking a language away because a population shifts? And those resources for that particular group, if they were to leave and go to another school across town where, let's say, Arabic is not as prominent, what happens with the child who no longer lives or is going someplace else? In terms of the resources for ELL language instruction. So I guess just again, there's been a decrease in ELL students in my district. What happens when there's a decrease? Do you do another reassessment of the language skill sets or resources you're going to provide? And then when the child moves to another part of the city, how do you know that the infrastructure for their ELL is going with them, or does it?
Mm-hmm. Those are really great questions, Councillor Edwards. I'm going to separate my question to two different buckets. The first bucket is that as an English learner that needs English language development services, a student can attend any school across the district and still get access to their services. It does not, the district is set up to be able to ensure that ESL is provided for the student regardless of which school they choose to attend. In terms of decrease, I might ask for some additional clarity. As English learners grow in their proficiency or as they're acquiring English, they do shift outside in terms of their marker from being an EL to a FEL, and we track them for 4 years within the system. So the district's platform is fully set up to be able to track our students. And so in terms of the decrease, are you seeing a decrease in terms of ethnic language communities or a decrease in the number of ELs themselves? Because which is the second bucket of my answer, that you might see a shift in the language population of a community as you've identified, where due to the impacts of COVID, parents losing their jobs, depending on what sector their families work in, we've seen a large migration of certain populations within the community who have left because they are unable to afford rent. And so a shift in terms of an ethnic language group may not necessarily be correlate to also an EL need. Because I might be a speaker of another language, but I might not necessarily be an English learner. So I'd love to hear a little bit more. It might not be.
What if they're the same? Or what if, let's act as though the shift is where that population is going because it's being displaced. You're also seeing a decrease in ELL students as well. So is that the bucket you were going to go on?
So if we assume with that, that you have both a language community and an EL community that is moving from one school to another, does the program move with them? So it takes time to be able to implement a new program in a new school. So for instance, if I have an Arabic community at a particular school, and there's a migration from that school of that population to another school, through the budget collab process established within the system, we would be able to see that data and see that students are moving and would see that trend. And then we would have to partner with the school and the community to be able to offer those opportunities to the new school where the students are coming up. Principals have been very on top of the shifts of their student community. And in terms of hiring, looking to make sure that they're hiring for bilingual staff. I also want to give a shout out to the recruitment and cultivation diversity team who've partnered with the Office of English Learners to continue to build up our pipeline to hire more bilingual staff across the district. But there are systems in place to support the district to track both the English learner as well as the language shift between schools, so that in our yearly planning, we can provide those supports.
So thank you for bringing up the supports specifically for ELL families and parents. What was spent, you may not have this off the top of your head, but for my district, what was spent directly on EL and immigrant parent supports?
I would have to defer to the budget team for that.
I don't actually have that information broken down by neighborhood. In terms of English learner spending by schools in your district, we certainly could provide that. Are you looking for specifically around parent support services, or are you looking across all English learner spending?
No, immigrant parent support services.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and work with Daphne's team to identify exactly the services and expenditure and how we allocate it across different schools. That's
I bring that up with wanting to know, is there an expected increase in that, and in those support services for immigrant parents, and considering the amount of money that's coming down, what would that increase look like, or what percentage of increase do you see?
Yeah, I mean, I will say just the biggest area of investment around immigrant support or sort of parent support is the family liaison investments, and with the emphasis on hiring staff that reflects the cultural and linguistic diversity of the schools in which they serve. As you know, we prioritized schools last year on 2 criteria. One was whether or not they were a transformation school, and the second was whether or not they had over 50% of the home language in a single other language, which meant additional allocations to a lot of schools in East Boston for their concentration of Spanish speakers. And so that's a big investment. Other investments around parent support, there's 2 ways in which we have Title I allocations that are set aside. So our federal funding through Title I program, we set aside 1% for parent support services. And then in addition to that, through a consent decree with Meta, we also set aside Title I funding in schools at the same percentage that they have English learners in that school, explicitly for the support of those students, which could include materials, curriculum materials, technology, but it could also include parent support services for English learners. And so those are ways in which we do make sure schools are targeting interventions and supports for those students.
I see the gavel. I just want one quick overall question, because I missed an earlier part of our budget conversation. I'm assuming the answer is no, but might as well ask the question. Do you see any decrease at all in the budgeting in my district for either East Boston High School or any of my schools? Do you see a decrease in budgeting and allocation of resources?
From year over year, I don't believe any of the schools in East Boston have a decrease. There are only a handful of schools that had any decreases, mostly related to change in programming.
East Boston, Charlestown, and the North End. So all 3.
Sorry, I did not mean to cut off the other parts of your district. I apologize. Miriam, I'm sure, is looking at the table, but no, I do not believe there was any changes East Boston, Charlestown, or the North End in terms of the budgets.
Thank you. I see the gavel.
Thank you, Councillor Edwards. Yeah, and the BPS team is putting, what is it, 18.5 million, Nate, into stabilizing school budgets. So a significant amount of the money they're asking us to authorize in new spend, like, is to prevent school budget level cuts, because the enrollment numbers would compel a large number of them if we don't do that.
Well, that's why I brought it up, because it was $1 million cut in East Boston before this, right? That caused me in that year to not vote for the school budget. So I want to make sure we were.
Yeah, and we're very excited about the 7 through 12 expansion at both Charlestown and East Boston High School. We really do think that that's going to be a strategy that responds to what families want to see in their high schools. And the superintendent has referred to them as pro-enrollment strategies. The idea that we will start to stabilize those pathways and be more competitive. There's some early evidence from the schools in your district that expanded to add the 6th grade, that we're already seeing some more retention of families in 4th and 5th grades, because they now have that single transition pathway K-12. So we're excited and continuing to monitor that very closely.
Thank you. I'm excited. I'll bring those questions up at another hearing on the Edwards and its expansion. Thank you, Councilor Bach.
Great, thanks so much, Councillor Edwards. And now I'll ask my questions. So I guess just starting with, and Ethan, I'm not sure how much this is your bailiwick, but are you in a position to talk about the McKinley Schools programming? You're muted.
Certainly, to some degree I can, and if we need to get you more information, we certainly will, but happy to take the initial set of questions.
Yeah, so just, well, first of all, if you could just clarify for me, and this is very much a naive question, but in terms of that chart, would those be sub-separate, or no, they'd actually be fully that top of the column? Can you just tell me the category?
Yeah, those are called, so the McKinley Schools the McKinley School is and the Horace Mann and the Carter School are public day schools, so that is a substantially separate school.
But the day schools had its own thing in the chart, didn't it?
Yes, has its own category. That's correct. And it's worth saying the McKinley is by far the largest of the 3 of them, correct? So important.
And how does, and I should just say, so I have 2 of the 3 campuses, although I think the less well-known ones, the sort of middle and high school campuses on Peterborough Street and in Audubon Circle in my district. Can you just talk to me about how, like, what's the pathway by which our students end up there, and what the total enrollment numbers are in the high school and the middle school?
Sure, and we'll see if we can get you the enrollment numbers.
Happy to have that as a follow-up.
Yeah, that's fine. But the procedure for going there, the process by which students end up at the McKinley Schools, is that if the team determines that you need a more restrictive placement for your own safety, other safety, because of the disability, because the services, there can be a lot of reasons the teams can make the decision that you need that more restrictive placement, but you make that more restrictive placement and then you go to a day school. And I actually should add that we're learning about the Horace Mann on the definition of the day school, but there are we're learning more about day schools that you can have other students in them, but it is generally considered the most restrictive environment.
Got it. And so, but in terms of like that determination, is it generally being made about students like between academic years? So they're starting at the McKinley like in a given year, or are they typically transferring into the McKinley, or how's that working?
It can be made it can be made at any time during the year. And so sometimes towards the end of the year, like this time of year, we might do a segmented IEP where the student means they stay in one setting from now until the end of the year, and then they would start the school fresh in September. But there are other times where you would do a transfer right now.
And in terms of things like the 4-year graduation rate outcomes, for students with disabilities. Do we have those? Do we have those by school? I know we have graduation rates by school, but like, I'm just sort of curious how the McKinley's doing. I know that we've recently had attention on the fact that it is disproportionately, Black and brown young men. I see that they're a tick more likely to be in the public day schools. And I'm just sort of wondering what our assessment of that program and what next steps going into the coming academic year for that program are.
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, I think it's a really, let's actually talk about performance, right? Let's actually talk about academic achievement. Let's talk about achievement rates. Let's talk about graduation rates and attendance and engagement. I think that's really important, and be happy to sort of get you further data on that. In terms of McKinley, obviously the superintendent decided to make a change and thinks that, we hope that we're headed in the right direction with regard to McKinley, and can get you more data that would reflect that, if you like.
Yeah, that'd be great. I would love a more detailed a report on sort of how it's doing on those academic indicators, and in terms of the change we're making, like what that's going to consist of. Because I feel very keenly that Councilor Edwards was talking about schools in the district. And I think that, although we don't have neighborhood schools in Boston, often our schools that are nearby, especially at the elementary level, they also have parents and families who are nearby. And so there's a natural constituency that talks to us. Mm-hmm. And I feel as though, honestly, I don't think that the parents of the children in the McKinley schools necessarily know that, like, I'm the counselor for 2 of their 3 buildings, right? And then, like, who the other counselors, and I worry that some of these specialized programs can fall between the boards in terms of our council attention. So I would really like some more 360 data on the McKinley.
Sure, that would be great. We'd be happy to get it. I think a critical piece that you're talking about is community engagement with those families as well, and making sure that they feel like they're a full part of the community, particularly for our kids with emotional impairments, not exclusively to McKinley, but we are starting a program where next week, we're having a meeting with families of students with emotional impairments who are in as substantially separate settings, because I think getting their perspective and their input on what their experience is like is going to be really important.
All right, great. Looking forward to follow up on that. And then one question for me, because I'm going to run out of time, is just for Daphne. I know was it last year that we were piloting a Vietnamese program? Can you tell me a little bit about that? Because obviously, last year turned into a bit of a mess of a year, maybe to pilot something. So
last year was was a year without power. We are grateful towards the Vietnamese community who entrusted to us their children for K2, where we launched the K2 classroom virtually in the midst of COVID. We had about 15 students who showed up, and they went through the process of being all virtual, hybrid, and then at this moment, all students have returned for full in-person instruction. So that's very exciting. We were able to, in the midst of COVID, partner with Dr. Natalie Tran from California, Fullerton University, I believe, who was able to provide deep coaching for the teacher virtually to support language instruction for the Vietnamese student population, and also non-Vietnamese students were part of that classroom. Next year, we're opening up a grade 1, so the parents have continued to say yes to BPS. And we'll be moving to the Mather, opening up a K2 and grade 1 simultaneously. And the Mather community will be hosting some informational sessions to welcome the families that have registered for the K2 grade 1 classroom for next year. We actually have probably about 10 new students who've registered for the Vietnamese program. Despite all of the challenges that we have faced to implement a bilingual Vietnamese program virtually during COVID. So I give credit to both BPS leadership for trusting the process to the school leaders who embraced and welcomed the students and supported them, and also to the families in Boston who organized and continue to organize to let us know what their needs are.
Great. Yeah, no, and I know that have been long dreamt of in the Vietnamese community, and I know Viet Aid and others have been involved, and just would love to continue to hear about the progress on that. It's something that last year we heard a lot of advocacy on.
We can definitely invite you to some, there will be some celebratory events with the Vietnamese community. We can definitely inform you of those events.
Great, wonderful. And then, all right, I think those are my questions for now. And then we're about to go back up to the top, and it'll be Councillor Flynn and Councillor Sabi George. But before we do that, because we're 2 hours in and we do have one person who's here for public testimony, like yesterday, I am just going to take one public testifier, just so that, you know, we get somebody in. So Mr. Charlie Kim is here. Mr. Kim, you have the floor.
Hello, Chair Buck. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for accepting my request for public comments. I was actually called out of a very important work meeting, as many people had called me on stating that special education was actually presenting and that budgetary information was being presented. I want to introduce myself as first the Special Education Parent Advisory Council. I'm one of the board members, so we do officially meet weekly with the Office of Special Education, specifically the Assistant Superintendent, Ethan Diabloman Burns. So a lot of the information that has been presented tonight is new to us, and some of those questions that we ask constantly on a weekly basis about data. We ask questions, and my daughter is also at the Horace Mann School. We ask a lot of these questions about how is the service, the quality, and then what is the Office of Special Education doing to change some of those policies. So some of the items that were presented tonight, and they're being questioned, and I really would ask the city councilors to really lean in and drive in on those questions and some of the data, and not just take the answers as for what the answers are, to really ask for follow-ups on the information, questions on the McKinley schools, the numbers, really challenge those. Questions on the Horace Mann School. I believe that there was a question as to the declining enrollment, and the answer was about technology and cochlear implants. That answer, I think, is something that should be leaned into even further and asked, so how is that the case, and where is that information coming from? Is there supportive data? Because these are not only information, some of it's anecdotal, but there's also science backing that. So if there is something where declining enrollment and somebody stating that parent choice to a school based upon technology access, allowing a student to be able to be mainstreamed, if that's backed by science and also by education and standards, I believe that that should be challenged. I'd like to ask a question on that, in the sense that we had brought up to school committee, we brought it up to city council, and also to the Office of Special Education, that the Office of Special Education actually has a separate team doing assessments for deaf and hard of hearing students within the district, known as the mainstream team. It is actually on the website. That team does not collaborate with the members and the specialists of the Horace Mann School for the deaf and hard of hearing. So if screenings and placements are happening in a vacuum, in an echo chamber, without specialists from the Horace Mann School, how can the Office of Special Education actually substantiate and say that parents are given choice, that they're actually given an educated option in choosing how their child can be placed in an environment where dual language is emphasized, and also where a culture known as the deaf culture would be embraced and taught to a child? Because the science and the actual statistics show, I believe the number that I was told is that 80% of children are born that are born deaf and hard of hearing are born within hearing families. So that means that that child should learn how to embrace not only deaf culture, but also language, and families should also be introduced to that. And I was introduced to that by my daughter through the Horace Mann School, and embracing and teaching us not only deaf culture, but also language. One thing that I do want to state is that there are many challenges going on within special education, but then also at the Horace Mann School for the deaf and hard of hearing. As you know, There is a infrastructure question that is going on right now. Where is the temporary swing space going to be? Where is the permanent space going to be? I'm not sure if you're aware, but there's a principal search going on. So a long-term leader, a nationwide search is going on right now to find a leader for the next leader for the Horseman School. And also DESE has been coming in on a regular basis to really take a look, because we asked them to lean in and take a look at the school as to the Boston Public Schools policies. And the assistant superintendent talked about day school and the actual term of day school, and day school being the most restrictive. Well, on March 16th, the assistant superintendent attended a meeting with DESE and directors of DESE at the Horseman School that I attended. And they specifically stated that BPS's policies on day school and inclusion are 20 years out of date. They specifically stated in 2001, the definition of a day school was clearly defined and that BPS is not following that definition. A day school does not have to be the most restrictive environment. If there are inclusive, if it is an inclusive environment, there can be changes, there can be different ways of looking at a day school for services. That is what a day school is for, is to service a student that needs those specific services, not to be defined as the most restrictive environment and to categorize students. That was the one thing that DESE specifically stated. Boston Public Schools still categorizes students. They use terms to categorize students where the rest of the state, the rest of the nation have moved away from these categories for special education. And that is something that I'm learning at the same time. But what bothered me as I learn is that my daughter goes through this. They're saying that this is 20 years old, that these policies are outdated by 20 years. Let's think about not only categories of special education students, but the conversation of race, the conversation of inequities. This all comes in together when it comes to language. It's all coming up now. But if DESE, the state, and Boston Public Schools have known that these policies are outdated by 2 decades, what does that mean? Are we going to continue to have conversations, or are we actually going to lean in and do something about it? And that's what I come and ask and challenge, that the assistant superintendent, the data that is released should be asked, it should be double checked, it should be substantiated, because an answer with information, there has to be supporting information on an educational perspective and also on a scientific basis. And then also the answers that come from the chief financial officer, how they're spending money and they're putting money into it. What does that mean? And then what are the results of that money that's going into it? We have $400 million coming in for ESSERs. $400 million on top of the $1.3 billion annual budget to Boston Public Schools. That's a lot of money. That is a lot of money that our children deserve, that the teachers and educators deserve, and the families deserve. And to make sure that that money is actually being placed and used appropriately to actually make Boston Public Schools a gem, the jewel, however things are being defined, is so important. And we have a very short period of time to figure that out. And I hope that there's going to be a lot of challenges and questions on the answers that come out of the Office of Special Education and also out of the Chief Financial Officer's office. So thank you for allowing me to go off a little bit here, but I appreciate that you allowed me to speak.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kim. Thanks for your advocacy for your daughter and for this whole school community. I appreciate it. And thank you to my colleagues for being able to wait for a minute. When our hearings go so long, I like to be able to get some of the public in. All right, so next up is Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Council Block. Council Block, I'm just going to continue listening to my colleagues with questions and answers. I don't have anything right now.
Okay, great. Councillor Asabi George. You're muted, Councillor Asabi George.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I have just a quick question. I'm grateful my colleagues got to some really thoughtful questions to today's hearing. But I'd like to talk just for a moment, if someone could, about the STRIVE program. We know how important transitions are and appropriate transitions, especially for our students with some needs, and also creating opportunities for work and career after graduation. How many students are currently in the Strive program, and how do we, how can we work to better support it? I've seen Strive in action with our BPS students in partnership with some of our institutional partners, teaching kids some life skills, some work skills, doing some real trainings. And, I want to make sure that we're supporting this effort and continuing to give these opportunities to our students across the district.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Asabi George, for bringing that really important question and thinking about our students who get the transition services. I'm going to have to get you an exact number on the number of students in the Strive program, but we do have about 4,000 transition age students. So that should be experiencing and going through the transition services. And I just want to call out Marcia Fitzpatrick, our Assistant Director for Transition, who's done a great job bringing shape to it and building partnerships to serve our students who are transitioning to their adult services. It's incredibly important, and it's been exciting to hear over the course of the year as kids get to start their internships, as they've been going back in person, and even some of the virtual ones. These are people who have just worked really, really hard to make sure kids are getting what they need in terms of those transition services. So I know that it was something that we did have some struggles with previously in BPS, but since we've brought in an assistant director and have this Strive team and an assistant director dedicated to transition, I think it's brought a lot of shape to the program, and it's been exciting to hear what our students are able to do.
Great, and I look forward to that, and just want to, I omitted to just give a shout out and some thanks to the teachers who are involved in that program, in particular Brenda and Jake, who I worked with formerly at East Boston High School. So just grateful for everyone's efforts on behalf of our students. Thanks,
Absolutely.
Ethan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's it for me this afternoon.
Great, thank you, Councillor Asabi George. And Councillor Flynn has asked if he can claw back a little bit of his time for one question. I'm going to allow it. So Councillor Flynn.
Yeah, thank you, Council Block, and I apologize to my colleagues for jumping in line. I guess my question is to Nate. Nate, can you tell me a little about the Junior ROTC program? I have great respect for this program, for the students that participate in it, the instructors as well. It's an exceptional program. I hope we're not cutting this program. What can you tell me about it, Nate?
I agree. This is a great opportunity for our students. And the JROTC program is a program that is partially reimbursed by the federal government. And so each of the positions that we have are sort of half on the BPS budget and half reimbursed through that program. There are no planned reductions in JROTC that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you. I don't think there's a more diverse program in BPS and the Junior ROTC program. I'm a strong supporter of that program. I admire those students that work hard and do their best and become great citizens as well. Nate, if there's any talk at all about cuts to JROTC, would you call me up immediately and let me know, because I need to be aware of them. And I'm going to advocate for them wherever they're at, because I know the important role that program plays in the lives of many students. Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Councilor Block, for giving me the opportunity to get back into line. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. And our next up is Councillor Flaherty. Are we still? Oh, I think Councillor Flaherty's had to go. So go to Councillor Braden.
Oh, it's me back. I'm going to be persist in my questioning with regard to the deaf schools and deaf culture. I just feel like a cochlear implant is a piece of it's a mechanical, it's a device that's implanted in in the head for a deaf child. They tend to have a shelf life of about 15 years. Insurance doesn't pay for a second one at this point in time, as far as I understand. I really feel that relying on a piece of technology to bridge that gap without teaching children American Sign Language and allowing them to access the deaf culture, the history, and be with deaf peers is problematic to me and to many of the parents that I've spoken to recently. I really feel that we have to have a very robust conversation about the future of the Horace Mann School for the Deaf and the future of deaf education in the city of Boston. I think I want to continue this conversation going forward. In terms of are students with cochlear implants taught sign language, or are they expected to be hearing students? Do they have access to a teacher for the deaf in their classroom if they're not at the Horace Mann? And is it just on a sessional basis, or do they have someone who is proficient in teaching American Sign Language and instructing in American Sign and teaching a subject in American Sign Language? Then do they have access in school to the mapping of these cochlear implants so that that is fine-tuned so that they can actually get the best utility out of the cochlear implant? The other question I had was with regard to our visually impaired students. I don't know how many visually impaired or blind students do we have in Boston Public Schools? How many teachers of the visually impaired do we have? And how many orientation and mobility instructors do we have? Thank you.
Sorry, Councilor Braden, I was muted. Thank you for those questions, certainly with regard to specific numbers and numbers of students and numbers of teachers. With regard to those various related service providers, I'd be happy to get those for you. I know right now it is really hard to find teachers of the visually impaired, so we're working hard to find a substitute right now. Like it is, those low incidence disabilities, it is often hard to find the teachers, but we absolutely do have teachers of visually impaired, the orientation and mobility, and teachers of the deaf and hard of hearing. And I can certainly get you those numbers. I in no way want to imply that we're sort of relying on cochlear implants. I'm simply saying that it is an element in people's decision-making. I'll just leave it at that in terms of where students, in families, for families where their child goes to school. I just want to say that, and that we need to get to a point, and I believe we're, where family choice is the driving principle of where our students go to school. And we certainly are working towards that. There is, and so we're working towards that. I also want to acknowledge what Mr. Kim said about the day schools and our understanding of day schools, and what had been a common understanding of day schools in BPS is as the most restrictive environment, and that you can do inclusion in day schools. So we are thinking through what the implications of that are and what that means in particular for a dual language school like the Horace Mann School, and what that means for programming there, particularly as we look to a new future with a new head of school and also hopefully a new facility in the next few years. So just want to acknowledge what Mr. Kim mentioned there. And then there is the issue of deaf culture and ASL, absolutely, and that is an element in decision making as well, and something when it comes down to that's why family choice is so important.
So I had another question about, early education for deaf children. Like there's pretty well documented evidence that even hearing children benefit from learning sign language because at the stage when they're sort of pre-verbal and don't have the articulation to express themselves, that they can actually communicate with sign language. So, you know, it's really feel that it's critically important for our deaf children, especially that they be introduced to sign language. And I know this is more of a pre-K question rather than a kindergarten forward question, but you know, I think really thinking about those resources and making sure that even if even if parents decide to make it school a legitimate choice, if that's their choice, to send it to do an integrated path, inclusionary path, that those students get early, those little ones get early access to, and their parents get early access to American Sign Language, so that they can get started and really feel that it certainly helps a lot. I know from my own experience of working with special needs children, being able to communicate and have some way to express yourself other than having a tantrum and having behaviors. Once you give them some sign language ability and some way to communicate, then those behaviors decline rapidly, and they feel that they're being understood and heard in a way. So I look forward to continuing.
I look forward to continuing the conversation and with both you and Mr. Kim. And also, I would just say that, I mean, I think that's the power of the horseman, is that dual language piece. It's all about language access as well. So, I mean, as in some of the crosswalk between, you know, the Office of English Learners and our language access and special education all gets wrapped up there. So,
and especially for those families who English is not their English not their first language, that the ASL can be a bridge to a whole new world. Yeah,
no question.
Very good. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Braden. Next up is Councillor Campbell. Councillor Campbell.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Bach. And I just wanted to thank Mr. Kim for taking time to testify, because I do think he lifts up a lot of the frustration for many parents, right? Just as we are planning and doing better and looking to do better, folks want to know in the immediate, what is the district doing to support their current student and family? They want to frankly be over communicated with. And I think the district has struggled with that for years. And I'm not just saying that as a counselor. You know, I used to represent students largely against BPS in education cases, a lot of special needs cases and school discipline cases, and saw the struggles in trying to get the right placement, getting IEPs set up. It's a very difficult and challenging process with parents really struggling to get the information they need. So I just wanted to lift up that many of his concerns, of course, are shared by many parents. And I do think we need to think about all the time how we can over communicate, because if we don't, there's just a continued sort of distrust, I think, with parents and families. And so, you know, we'll keep pushing the issues for sure. And even as I was listening to other counselors, I was connecting with my chief of staff on what we're doing with respect to English learners. And this is near and dear to her, as she was one of those students at BPS. And I know that we are visioning and reimagining, which is important to do. I think we maybe got started a little late, but we want to be intentional. We want to include folks in this process. But again, families want to know, if I have a student right now who is an English learner, will they have access to a dual language program? Will they have access to the services that they need? And so just that is a struggle that we're grappling with as we deal with constituents on a day-to-day basis. And my son Aiden also agrees. You want to come to the hearing? So, and then I just following up on something that Councillor Bach requested, demographics, enrollment numbers from the Kinley schools. Also wanted to request that as well. And also if there is demographics within the enrollment numbers in terms of race, gender, et cetera, would also like that. So through the chair would add that to a sort of request for information, and can follow up on that. But the bigger issue is in the context of, and I'm not discounting girls and issues with girls, but in the context of boys, been really connecting with a lot of folks, including a recent conversation with the president of HBCU, who's been studying this for a really long time, maybe for the last 20 years, on just how boys are responded to in the classroom. And it's not just over discipline for what was frankly just boy or children behavior. it is this separation to, sent to McKinley schools. It's even reflected in how they might be graded. So just this cultural shift that needs to happen in school systems and how we educate boys, frankly, all boys of every demographic. And it is exacerbated for boys of color. And so I'm just curious, where in the district, what team and who was responding to these larger issues of how boys tend to be treated? I think about my twin brother all the time because he was at McKinley for a period of time, and you saw the distinctions. We were both dealing with trauma of how he was responded to was very different than how I was responded to. And so who in the district is really grappling with this culture, looking to shift it? What research are they looking at to shift culture and practice at every juncture, including at the early years where it starts, to address these issues of just over-discipline and how we react to boys generally? Something that I'm just sort of in the weeds on right now, which I think connects the McKinley programming, but it's bigger than that. It's a cultural, it's a cultural shift that's needed within this school district and so many others.
I can take a first pass if that's okay for the rest.
Thank you.
No problem. Over the last couple of years, I know the district has done several reports around the needs of boys, Black and brown boys in BPS. And I believe under Charles and also the Office of Opportunity Gap, they continue to work with the 10 Boys Initiative, work that has been launched to intentionally support our Black and brown boys. But what you're also identifying, City Councilor Campbell, is this shift. It's a mindset shift that needs to happen within the instructional ground. And the work that we're doing in the academics office under the leadership of Dr. Mara Johnson is to look at how do we deal with biases that are inherent within the work. You've identified this concept of gender, but imagine when a student is an immigrant student who's an English learner, who is a Black or Hispanic boy, who has no support, or it is also special ed within that classroom setting. I mean, the issues and the concerns for that student is not sending that child to another teacher or another setting. It is how do we as a community support, embrace, love upon that student to ensure that, as was stated by Nate at the beginning, the vision is the greatness within all students. And that mindset shift for us is something that we want to be able to launch and do now. And that is why I think Dr. Mara Johnson talked a little bit about reviewing a lot of our curriculum with that bias, with a frame of dealing with biases as one of the many works, the work that Ethan is doing in terms of reviewing how special ed services are provided to their students, and the work that we're doing in the Office of English Learners, looking at language as an asset. We're trying to, within this next couple of months, integrate it so that by next year we can launch a full integrated vision of shift for the district.
I appreciate that response, and I know it's a longer conversation, which I'll continue offline with you guys, but it's a necessary one because it shows up in, I think, very detrimental effects later on in many ways, and with respect to boys, and of course in different ways with respect to girls too. So I appreciate that. And just lastly, we'll say, before I see a gap, we'll start to wave. On the back to sort of the inclusion questioning, the inclusion questioning, you guys are gonna love this. This is who's sitting next to me. Say hello. Matt went outside. So the inclusion questions is really this idea of what does it mean for the district to set some standards, because you are seeing differences along school levels, right? Which is, or at the school level, which is creating these inequities. So really looking forward to continuing that conversation as well offline to have what that standard looks like. But I think it's also the larger question of what's the district responsible for, what's in the purview of the district and what's in the purview of a school, and making those distinctions really clear so parents and families have a sense of what that is. Okay, say goodbye. I'll see you later. I'll be back.
Hi, buddy.
Ethan, just I want to make sure, was Ethan going to try to get in on anything? It looked for a minute like you were.
Well, I don't know if I mean, I just look forward to having that conversation with Councillor Campbell around inclusion and the standards, because the standard is, needs to be driven by the IEP, and we need to be implementing the IEP. And, the standard is, I'll leave it at that, but look.
Yeah, to be determined, but we'll follow up, and I'll remain on the hearing for the rest of the hearing.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Bach.
Great, thanks so much, Councillor Campbell. Next up is Councillor Mejia, and then it will be Councillor Edwards. Councillor Mejia.
Yes, so I just have a few questions. I know I asked earlier about just the number of dollars that we're spending on special education, and just curious about what the return on investment is. Can you just give me a ballpark figure of how many dollars we spend on special education?
Yes, I can. As I pull that up, I'll just add that in special education, there are 3 different categories of special education spending. There's the dollars that is being spent for the special education central office department. That's Ethan's team and the money in that department. The second is spending on special education teachers and special education accounts. Those are for, dollars that are specifically set aside for those items. Then the final category is spending on programs, the program code for special education. Across all of those, I was trying to talk and look for a file at the same time. Turns out I cannot do 2 things at once.
That's okay. While you're looking that up, I guess it would be helpful for those who are tuning in to understand, if I think it's based on weights. Like, so if your child is classified as special education, there's an additional X amount of dollars that is associated with that child, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I'm curious if let's just say $14,000, right, is allotted for students. I think whatever it is. Of those dollars, does every single dollar get spent to support the educational plan of that child?
So the total spending across the district for special education across the categories that I mentioned is $337 million. What you're referring to is the allocations that are given to students through our weighted student funding model.
I was just kind of buying you a little bit of time, because I guess what I'm trying to get to is that that's a big chunk of change. And I'm curious if every single dollar is accounted for the services that are delivered to these children who are in need.
Yeah, so in terms of accounting, so we go through a number of different annual audits of both our federal and local dollars. And so when we allocate money out for particular positions that are meant for special education staffing, there's a number of steps in the process to make sure that schools are buying the staff that they're required, that the staff have the appropriate license. Daphne had already mentioned earlier, there's a process we refer to as budget collaboratives, which is that's really the start of the special education budgeting process, really the school budgeting process. So a team comes together with the enrollment projections and the budgets that schools receive, and part of it is cross-functional problem solving. That's the collaborative part, and part of it is compliance checks to make sure that if you're projected for specific students, that you are budgeting to make sure you have the appropriate programs. Then our Office of Human Capital goes through and makes sure that you have the appropriate licensing for the teachers that are in that. And then it's posted and hiring is monitored to make sure that when they hire staff, they're meeting that license. So there are multiple checks in the process, both before any money is spent, as money is being spent, and then after money is being spent, to go back and verify that it was spent for the purpose in which we had budgeted for it.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm gonna ask a question about I'm an English language, and I don't know how to say this word. Compensatory compensatory.
Yep.
How you say it?
Yeah, compensatory services.
Compensatory. Okay, students with high needs are eligible for that word services as a result of school closures during COVID. Schools must identify students who are entitled to compensatory services above and beyond typical services. How is the district identifying students with high needs? And how many students have been identified? Districts are required to have meetings to determine compensatory services. How many meetings have occurred? And how and when are services delivered after school, weekends, etc.? So can you just give me some insight? That's a question that came in from someone who couldn't be here because she didn't know about this hearing, and that's Edith Bazil. So she submitted that question, and obviously I would not use words that I don't know how to pronounce, but I needed to throw that in there. So if somebody could answer that, I'd appreciate that.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Mejia, for the question. Yes, many people struggle on that word. We're not the first. So yes, DESE set out, Department of Elementary Secondary Education set out, and Massachusetts, these are the only state where they required the level of rigor around compensatory services that for here in Massachusetts, and they did prioritize our high needs students for needing compensatory services. So those students were the same students that were prioritized for in-person learning in the fall. So those were the students. I can't remember, I don't have it right in front of me, but it is the same group of students that were prioritized for in-person learning in the fall when we were able to bring students back. We have done a lot of training with our coordinators around holding these meetings. It's a whole new set of sort of processes to go through. You want to gather data both from the family on how the student did during COVID, and originally it was only from March to June, the period that they were using, and then they started to include the rest of this year as well. So they shifted the guidelines as we moved ahead into it. I guess what's really important is to say it's the principles of compensatory services that are important. This is an opportunity for to be a piece of the return, recover, reimagine, so that students are able to get the service they need to get back on track. And we have worked really hard to make sure that our coordinators know how to hold these meetings, are able to hold these meetings, and indeed that they're happening. So we have reached about over 4,000 agreements now across the district in terms of the agreements. And we will be providing those services. Some of those services are being delivered now, both after school. There are some being delivered after school. There's some going to be delivered during the summer, some in person, some remote. And we fully expect that some services will be delivered in the fall, and that's okay. We want to make sure kids get what they need. The last point on that is just that we've engaged with the community. We had 3 community meetings to be able to make sure that students understand, that families know what is possible and available with regard to compensatory services.
What's the dollar amount? Do you know?
We don't have a total dollar amount yet. We allocated a number at the beginning. We weren't sure what it would be, but we're using CARES funding for that. So Nate, I don't know if you want to address the financial impact of that, but we want to make sure that kids get what they need.
Yeah, I would just add is it goes to the financial projection on that. This is not, because this is not a single year effort, right? The effort to come up with compensatory services to make sure the students are made whole, which will cross multiple fiscal years. And so we'll continue to monitor it and set aside the dollars we think. We set aside a fairly conservative amount for this year. So we know we'll have enough resources, and this is an area of academic recovery. We talk about that 20% that we'll need to continue to monitor. And because it's so individually driven, it's really difficult for us to project fully until all of the meetings and all of the sort of issues are surfaced.
And one last question before Councilor Buck does the gavel. I asked the question last week, I guess, with the law department folks, in regards to lawsuits that have been formed against BPS for IEPs and things of that nature, and they didn't have they said that this was something that BPS could answer. And I'm just curious, Nate, if you happen to have any information in terms of how much money we as the district have spent on defending IEP lawsuits against us for services not rendered.
I'd have to look into that and get back to you on that. I don't have that information readily available.
Okay. And then in regards to, the McKinley School, I addressed this earlier in some other hearing. I can't remember which day it was anymore, but it was in regards to literacy and how, I'm just curious about when we think about how we're passing students from grade to grade, often who are struggling to read and write. What are we doing as a district to identify like early intervention, warning signals and signs to help support students who may have dyslexia? I know that students who have dyslexia, particularly students of color, this is not something that we see a lot of early detection on. So I'm just curious, Ethan, what are we doing to support those students?
Yeah, terrific. Thank you, Councillor Mejia. As I've said earlier, reading, our strategic reading approach needs to start in the general education classroom and be a strong tier one. It's not even a support, it's what we do. If you'd want, I don't know if Dr. Romero Johnson wants to address this, but that is it should not be only a special education issue. If students need special education supports, of course, we want to make that happen, but we want to make sure that kids get the reading skills they need early on so that they don't become special education students. Not that it's a bad thing, but that if they're not, we don't want that to happen because we didn't do the right thing. We want to make sure kids get what they need early on from the beginning. And I would refer you to, and we'll see if we can send it to you, before school committee, we did an early intervention reading presentation, and we can make sure you get that.
Thank you. I see the gavel. I don't have any more questions for today.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Mejia. And now I'm going to ask my questions, and then I'll just say to councillors who are still on the call, I think everyone's gotten their questions in. If you've got a follow-up, raise your blue hand, because otherwise we will close it out after I finish mine. So I want to just follow up on the compensatory services point. So Nate, how much did we reserve though for this year in CARES money for that?
The amount of money for the spring compensatory services we had set aside initially was, I believe, $5 million of the original. This was part of the original CARES Act funding, recognizing that most of the meetings were happening this spring, and it would be sort of, when I meant conservative, meaning that we felt confident that we would be able to, that would be enough for us to be able to cover the services that were needed. And this is a rare statement for me, but I wanted, we worked very closely with Ethan and his team to make sure that they knew that this was just a placeholder for us as we got more information, that we are not managing them to that budget. The important thing here was to make sure students' needs were met, and just to keep in constant communication, because it's really important for us to make sure it really is driven by the individual student conversations.
Got it. And sorry, was that original CARES? Was that ESSER 1? Is that out of ESSER 2?
That was original CARES. So of the original 32 million we had set aside, because it's current year costs, we have not yet officially applied for and received ESSER Part 2. And so anything that we've talked about spending for this current fiscal year is part of the original CARES Act.
Right. Okay. And then was there also in a similar vein, because I saw that 5 million, and then was there 2.2 for ELL or 2.25?
Yeah, there are a couple numbers that are sort of similar. in sort of total dollar amounts, we had put a placeholder in original budget proposal for FY22 around additional supports that we were planning to provide for next year for students. And again, this was meant to be just sort of an initial sort of thinking, and we really put that number out there before we knew the full picture of federal funding. But the idea being that it would go towards compensatory services in the case of special education students, because that's a particular legal term. But then in addition, recovery supports for English learners, special education students. That could include tutoring, it could include additional academic supports during the year, and could include summer programming. And so the idea being that what we want to do is be able to offer multiple ways of supporting students. And so that's the 2.2 that you're seeing as part of the English learner sort of placeholder.
Got it. And where, I mean, because yeah, I mean, as you know, I think that it makes good sense to give our departments some money that they know that they can expect to have in FY22, since FY22 starts on July 1st, which is also the 5th meeting of the ESSER group. So in terms of those, understanding that the 2.25 is a number that, you know, Daphne and ELL folks can work with, but then, you know, can hope for more, right? But it gives you something to think about. Mm-hmm. What are the other numbers like that? Because it sounds like the 5 million is for FY21 support, right?
Yeah,
there'll be a lot more work we'll do in FY22 on the compensatory services side, which we're obligating ourselves to right now. And then what else should be on my mental map on this?
We have a full list of the initial proposals around ESSER. The ones that come to mind is there's additional CARES costs that we are continuing in terms of cleaning protocols and ongoing costs that we've identified. We had set aside and sort of, it was meant to be sort of, as you mentioned, a planning and an early signal around spending on English learners and special education. A lot of the summer spending that we're doing for this will be a mix of federal and general funds for this summer. And so a lot of the summer planning that will be done on ESSER will actually be for the following summer. And then there were other funding that was earmarked towards some of our, and appropriate for the conversation today, the work around the Office of Equity Strategy and Achievement Gaps, Opportunity Gaps, excuse me, around their anti-racist work within the district as well. So we had designated some of that early funding. Miriam, I don't know if there were other items on that list that I'm missing.
The other big ones were hub schools and also additional academic interventions and tutoring, which we talked about earlier today.
Right. So I think it would be helpful for the council to have, if you guys, it sounds like you have the makings of this document already, or maybe you've done it for school committee or a few different school committee presentations, but it would be helpful for the council to understand at a slightly more granular level of detail beyond what's in that slide that you have, Nate, at the beginning of the presentation, and kind of like how much of the federal money's been obligated, where we've put out signals, right, from a planning perspective, and then what we're, because it sounds like some of that, the planning signal money, right, is crossing into the ESSER 2 space.
Yeah, that's the initial plan. So yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the distinction being that as we continue to go through this spring, the CARES Part 1 is, you know, we are continuing to monitor costs around food and nutrition services, increased costs around transportation due to protocols. There's a lot of costs that we're monitoring. So that's a lot of the CARES Part 1 is in response to what we're experiencing as we reopen. And then, yeah, to your point, it's not officially obligated for ESSER Part 2 until we submit the application, but we can share with you what we had communicated to school committee around some of the planning on that had been on sort of designated for ESSER Part 2 going forward.
Great, yeah, because I do think that's part of the whole picture for the council in understanding how we're going to meet the year ahead. And I do think it would be helpful to get some sense. I understand that every one of these agreements with our families is different, but you know, presumably you know more about what the scale of that's going to look like 4,000 agreements in than you did when you were 0 agreements in. So you must have some projections of where we're going cost-wise on compensatory services.
Yeah, I mean,
And I mean that projecting from where what we're finding, not in terms of, to your point, managing to a budget, right? But just.
Yeah, to a certain extent, there's so much, this is so highly individualized. For instance, it could be the case that the early compensatory services that we worked out, it's because they are sort of the more straightforward IEP meetings that the team is having. And so it could represent an under estimate of costs and the true costs. Or some, I think we can certainly pull together some information, but I don't want to be overly confident in projecting something based on a methodology that is really
Yeah, I get it. So do we have a timeline for when we expect like the bulk of the agreements to have been reached? You're muted, Ethan.
Yeah, I can chime in on that. Thanks. Just that, I think what the state has directed is it's also hard to, what the state has directed is that you need to reach out to every family, and every family is entitled to a meeting. And what we've said is that you need to reach out repeatedly, like a number of times. But we're also hearing that a lot of families, particularly at the middle school and high school level, are sort of like, my kid's not going to any more school anyway. Like, school's been so brutal this year that it's just hard to get that. Now, we are tracking them down because we know that there's students who may need services. So it's hard to know what target we're shooting for. And also, we know, while we have done, 3 community meetings to try and educate people about compensatory services, we reached 400, 500 people, but that's not 10,000. So how do we educate the public in terms of community service, in terms of compensatory services, and what do we do about that is a hard one. So we're at 4,000 now. We're working with our union partners to come to agreement about how we're going to get all these done. And hopefully, once we reach agreement there, we will see an acceleration of getting them done.
Got it. Okay. And then I just one comment on the Councilor Flynn brought up dyslexia services, and I think it also just came up in a question for Councilor Mejia. I just want to strongly stress, I have a cousin who has been incredibly successful and has ended up as a member of the bar and a practicing lawyer, who really got treated early on like he wasn't very bright because he had dyslexia, and as soon as it was actually diagnosed and there was actually assistance for him to learn to read, everything turned around. And I just think all the time about first of all what the impact of those first couple of years were on him before that point of kind of the sense of like there's just something that's something wrong with you, right? That's like, as a kid you internalize those kinds of things and it's so damaging. And the change that happened when he got the services that he needed, and the incredible degree to which he has now made a career based on words and reading and writing. It's something that I think about all the time. So I just want to add my voice to the chorus on that and the importance of early and aggressive identification and help on that front.
Good. I couldn't agree with you more, and think that the presentation to school committee on early literacy certainly lays out our plans in that area. We have a team that is meeting weekly with regard to the new guidance on dyslexia that is coming out or has come out. So we're trying to figure out what that looks like in terms of implementation for next fall, so that we have the right screeners and services in place. And again, just to emphasize, that needs to happen in the general education classroom, right? Eventually it may end up at special education, but it is really that the right intervention has to start in the general education classroom.
Yes, absolutely. And then can I just ask quickly, and I'm sorry, I just want to make sure that I understand it seems as though the part of the conversation, and I'm not as familiar as Councilor Braden with the Horace Mann School for the Blind, but reading between the lines, what I take to be the issue at partly, and I'm just going to ask if this is what it is that, you know, in general, one of our special education principles is that we try to serve people in the least restrictive context possible, right? That will serve them. But, and then you have the challenge that this, you know, that the Horace Mann is being coded a day school, which makes it restrictive, which means that that kind of basic instinct is, oh, you want to mainstream because that's what, like, inclusion is the direction of travel in our special education world. But then there's the problem that, like, there's actually like deaf culture and a dual language. And so therefore this kind of direction of travel on one regulatory regime kind of cuts against that. That's what I seem to be understanding to be at play. And I guess the thing I would say, and then it also sounded like there's some back and forth about like when, like in terms of family choice, to what extent parents who might be coming from hearing culture background, right, are exposed to the full degree of what it would mean. Because if I didn't know anything about that and someone just said, oh, well, we can prescribe this device and then you don't need to think about this, you know, that might be a very natural choice to make, but like actually, right, like choice is always about like what information you're making the choice on the basis of. So that's what I've heard some tension is like, are we in those meetings actually, you know, giving our family full exposure to what choosing the Horace Mann and such looks like? Is that part of what seems to be at play?
I think you touched on a lot of the tensions that are at play there, but I think an important piece to say here is like, there are incredible strengths at the Horace Mann School. The level of expertise is unbelievable. There are people there who know things and are able to do things with deaf and hard of hearing students. It's amazing. And the level of passion and commitment is incredible. And what we need to do is both find them a physical space, but also, to your point, sort of a policy space, like a regulatory space in which they're able to act out and serve as many kids as possible and do that and follow through on that expertise and passion. And we want to support them in being able to do that. And so, but we have some work to get there for all sorts of reasons, some of which you just mentioned. But that is our goal, is to be able to support them in doing that.
Okay, well, let me just cast my vote in favor of making sure that we create enough of that space to like have a really successful, you know, program be successful and not end up in a space where it would just be simpler. Because especially because I know we're going through school leadership change, right?
Oh,
like,
yeah.
You know,
we
wouldn't just
question.
say, oh, it'd be simpler to just kind of try to, you know, get it like mainstream everybody and not have an opportunity for this kind of.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, absolutely not. Like there's family choice, like into this Deaf Culture Piece, Center of Deaf Culture and Education, like it is, you know, we need to figure out how to make that happen. We need to collaborate with the school. As the district administration, we want to collaborate with the school and the community to make that happen.
Great. All right, I think I could go on asking questions, but as the chair, you also have to know when to call it. I think that I've got one person in the waiting room, so I'm just going to see whether Ms. Tao would like to testify, and then if not, we will. Pt.II, are you here to testify?
Keeping the streak alive from one of our earlier hearings.
Oh, is this one of your?
Patty is one of our secret weapons on the finance team. And I don't think she's here to testify, but many school leaders will tell you that Patty's one of the most creative and smartest people about helping schools think about their resources and their time. I enjoy this opportunity just to give her a little bit of a shout out, because she's somebody who likes to operate under the radar, and I'm assuming she doesn't have any testimony.
Well, we are always happy to spotlight the city's excellent public servants who, you know, operate behind the scenes. Thank you all. This is a really important set of topics. We definitely, you know, could have had and will on other occasions have hearings devoted uniquely to ELL and to inclusion. I mean, it just, yeah, there's a lot there's a lot in all this, and we appreciate the work that you all do on behalf of our students. And Sylvia, you just went back on screen, so I just wanted to say that I haven't directed that many questions your way today because I know we have you for the whole day next week, but lots of academic questions coming from the historian soon. So, all right, with that, we're a couple minutes shy of our informal deadline, and this hearing of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee is adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.